Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a forest ranger for over 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things in the woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night last October. It was a night that shook my understanding of reality and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The evening started like any other routine patrol. I'd been assigned to check on some of the more remote campsites in the northern section of the park. It was a chilly autumn night, and a light mist hung in the air, giving the forest an eerie, ethereal quality. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead as I made my way deeper into the woods. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something odd. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on what was bothering me. The forest seemed unusually quiet. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath. That's when I saw them, the tracks. My flashlight beam swept across the muddy ground, revealing a set of footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were enormous, easily twice the size of my own boots, and deeply impressed into the soft earth. Whatever had made these tracks was heavy, very heavy. My heart rate quickened as I crouched down to examine the prints more closely. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but with distinct claw marks at the ends of what should have been toes. I've tracked bears, mountain lions, and every other large predator in these parts, but these prints belonged to none of them. I stood up, my hand instinctively moving to the holster on my hip. The weight of my sidearm was reassuring, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind wondered if it would be enough against whatever had left those tracks. Pulling out my radio, I keyed the mic to call for backup. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Thompson. I've got some unusual tracks out here in Sector 7, requesting additional units to investigate." Static crackled in response. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, but the radio remained stubbornly silent. Great, I thought, of all the nights for the equipment to malfunction. That's when I heard it, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It was the distinct crack of a branch breaking somewhere off to my left. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching for the source of the noise. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was big, much bigger than a man, and covered in what looked like dark, shaggy fur. Before I could get a better look, it melted back into the shadows. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I tried to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. There was no animal native to these woods that matched what I'd glimpsed, yet the tracks at my feet and the lingering silence of the forest told me this was no ordinary night. I had a choice to make. The sensible thing would be to retreat, to get back to my vehicle and call for backup once I was in range. But curiosity and a sense of duty warred with my instinct for self-preservation. I was a ranger, damn it. It was my job to investigate and protect this forest. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I decided to follow the tracks. They led deeper into the woods, away from the marked trails and into a part of the forest I rarely patrolled. The undergrowth grew thicker, branches clawing at my uniform as I pushed through. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of wind through the trees sounded like a growl. I felt watched, hunted. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, I came to a small clearing. The tracks led straight to the center before vanishing. I swept my flashlight around, trying to pick up the trail again, but it was as if whatever had made the prints had simply disappeared into thin air. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me like a physical force. a rank, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, so strong I could almost taste it. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to gag. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to my holster. The beam of my flashlight illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I was no longer alone in that clearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive silence. "This is Ranger Thompson. Identify yourself." No response came, but I heard something. A low, rumbling sound that was halfway between a growl and a purr. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating in my chest. My eyes strained against the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw them. Two glowing orbs, reflecting the light of my flashlight. Eyes, but they were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. Whatever I was looking at had to be at least 8 feet tall. I drew my weapon, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. "Stay back," I shouted, trying to inject some authority into my voice. "I'm armed." The eyes blinked, once, slowly. Then they started to move, drawing closer. As they approached, I could make out more details of the creature. It was massive, its body a mountain of muscle covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. A broad, flat nose, a mouth full of sharp teeth, and those glowing eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the quiet of the forest, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The creature stopped its advance, cocking its head to the side as if curious. Then it roared. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was primal, a howl of rage and hunger that shook the very ground beneath my feet. Birds exploded from the trees, fleeing in terror, and I ran. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I kept running. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its heavy footfalls shaking the earth. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I remember is the pounding of my heart, the rasping of my breath, and the constant, terrifying knowledge that something was right behind me. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line and onto the main park road. My truck was there, right where I'd left it at the start of my patrol. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, and practically dove into the driver's seat. As I gunned the engine and peeled out onto the road, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, stood the creature. It made no move to follow, simply watching as I sped away. I drove straight to the ranger station, my mind reeling. When I arrived, my colleagues were shocked by my appearance. Uniform torn, face scratched, eyes wild with fear. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded crazy, even to my own ears. They organized a search party at first light, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the creature I'd described. If it weren't for the tears in my uniform and the scratches on my skin, I might have thought I'd imagined the whole thing. In the days and weeks that followed, I questioned everything about that night. Was it real? Had I somehow hallucinated the entire encounter? But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied explanation. I still work as a ranger, but I've requested a transfer to day shifts. I tell myself it's because I prefer the hours, but the truth is, I can't bring myself to patrol those woods at night anymore. Every time I look into the darkness between the trees, I remember those glowing eyes and that bone-chilling roar, and I wonder, not if, but when I'll see it again. Story 2. I never used to believe the stories. You know the kind. Tales from old-timers about strange creatures stalking the woods. They'd pass those stories around the ranger station after dark, swapping ridiculous accounts of unidentifiable noises or unexplained disappearances in the backcountry. I'd always listen, nod along, but deep down, I figured it was just a way for us to keep things interesting during those endless, lonely shifts in the middle of nowhere. But that night changed everything. It was a routine patrol on a quiet fall evening. The kind of patrol where the world feels like it's holding its breath, just waiting for the first snowfall to cover everything in a blanket of silence. The trees were bare, branches like skeletal hands reaching up into the pale, grey sky. It was the sort of quiet that presses against your ears, amplifying every little rustle of the wind or snap of a twig underfoot. I was about halfway through my shift, driving one of the more isolated trails in the reserve. Hardly anyone comes up this far. It's too remote, too rugged. It was my job to make sure no one was where they shouldn't be. No camps set up illegally, no hunters breaking the rules. But honestly, the woods felt deserted. There hadn't been any hikers or campers in weeks, with the cold settling in and tourists moving on to warmer spots. I was just about to turn back when I caught a glimpse of something ahead, just a shadow, barely noticeable, crossing the trail a few hundred yards in front of my truck. It was quick, too quick for me to get a good look, but it was big, bigger than a deer. I stopped the truck, leaving the engine idling as I scanned the area where I'd seen it. Nothing moved. But the trees felt wrong, like the silence had become too thick, unnatural even. I sat there for a minute, convincing myself it was probably just a bear, though deep down I knew that wasn't it. Whatever it was, it had moved with an eerie smoothness that didn't match the lumbering gait of a bear. Still, I shrugged it off and decided to check it out on foot. The air felt colder when I stepped outside, and I pulled my jacket tighter, reaching for the flashlight on my belt. I headed toward the spot where I thought I'd seen the shadow. The ground was thick with fallen leaves, crunching under my boots as I walked. Every step seemed louder than the last, echoing in the stillness of the forest. My breath came out in clouds, and the beams from my flashlight cut through the fading light as I pushed further down the trail. That's when I found the prints. At first, I thought they were bear tracks, but as I knelt down and shined the flashlight over them, I realized they weren't quite right. They were massive, sure, larger than any bear paw I'd ever seen, but they were elongated, almost like a human foot but distorted, too narrow, too long. And there were claws, deep, ragged gouges in the earth, like whatever made them had talons instead of nails. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that has nothing to do with the cold. Something primal, buried deep in my gut, told me to turn back, to get in the truck and leave. But years of training kept me rooted. I had to know what was out here. It was my job, after all. I followed the tracks, my heart thudding in my chest, each step heavier than the last. They led off the trail and into the dense forest, weaving between the trees, and I swear I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. But every time I looked back, there was nothing, just the same dark, silent woods. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller, thicker, their branches twisting overhead like a canopy of skeletal fingers. The sky was fading fast, the last traces of daylight swallowed up by the encroaching night. And that's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, just barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I froze, every muscle tensing as I strained to listen. The growl came again, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, guttural, and it made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I swung the flashlight in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding in my ears. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing nothing but the empty, shadowed woods. But the growling continued, growing louder, more aggressive. Whatever it was circling me. I turned slowly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that sound, but the trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. I was alone, or at least I wanted to believe I was, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Suddenly, Something darted between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. A flash of movement, too fast to see clearly, but it was big, bigger than anything that should have been out here. My heart was racing now, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I backed up, trying to retrace my steps, but no matter how far I went, the growling followed, always just out of sight, always just out of reach. And then I saw it. It was standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows, its eyes glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight. The creature was tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more, with a body that seemed half man, half beast. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout and pointed ears, but its posture was wrong. It stood upright, on 2 legs, its long arms hanging down at its sides, ending in claws that gleamed in the fading light. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. My breath caught in my throat, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. The creature's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, paralyzing fear wash over me. Then, without warning, it let out a deafening roar, the sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the ground. The light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the trees as I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop to pick up the flashlight. I didn't stop to look back. I just ran. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush, my lungs burning with every breath. Behind me, I could hear the creature crashing through the trees, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth as it gave chase. I don't know how I managed to stay on my feet, but somehow I did. Somehow I made it back to the trail, my truck just barely visible through the trees. I sprinted the last few yards, throwing myself into the driver's seat and slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition, but once the engine roared to life, I floored it. The tires spun in the dirt for a second before catching traction, and I sped down the trail, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I reached the ranger station. By then, my heart had slowed, but the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I sat in the truck for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no sense to it. There was no logical explanation for what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I finally got out and walked to the back of the truck, my breath coming in shaky bursts. That's when I saw the scratches, deep, jagged gouges raked across the tailgate, the kind of marks no animal should have been able to make. Not like that. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the rough metal, and that's when I knew. The stories weren't just stories. They were warnings, and whatever was out there, it wasn't finished with me yet. Story 3. I've been camping my whole life, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Cascade Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my 3 best friends. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It started innocently enough. Jack, Mike, Sarah, and I had been planning this trip for months. We were all experienced campers, but this was our first time in this particular area of the mountains. The park ranger had warned us about increased bear activity, but we weren't too concerned. We had bear spray and knew how to properly store our food. The first day was perfect. We hiked to a secluded spot near a crystal-clear stream, set up our tents, and spent the afternoon fishing and enjoying the crisp mountain air. As the sun began to set, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. That's when we heard it. A long, mournful howl echoed through the trees, causing us all to fall silent. It wasn't like any wolf howl I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, and seemed to carry an almost human quality to it. "What the hell was that?" Jack asked, his eyes wide as he scanned the darkening tree line. "Probably just a wolf," Mike said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Sarah shivered and moved closer to the fire. "I don't like it. It sounded wrong. I tried to lighten the mood. Come on, guys. We're in the middle of the wilderness. There are bound to be some strange noises. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest had gone eerily quiet, as if all the nocturnal creatures were holding their breath. We stayed up a bit later than planned that night, none of us wanting to be the first to retreat to our tents. When we finally did turn in, I lay awake for hours, listening intently to every rustle and crack from the woods around us. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent. The campsite was in chaos. Our food, which we had carefully hung from a tree branch, was strewn across the ground. The cooler was smashed to pieces, its contents scattered everywhere. Deep claw marks scored the trees around our camp, far larger than any bear I'd ever seen evidence of. Mike and Sarah emerged from their tent, looking as shell-shocked as I felt. "What happened?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, surveying the destruction. "But whatever did this, it wasn't a normal bear." That's when I noticed Jack's tent. The door was wide open, flapping in the early morning breeze. "Jack?" I called out, moving towards his tent. "Jack, you okay?" There was no response. I peered inside, my blood running cold as I saw his sleeping bag was empty. "Guys!" I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Jack's gone!" The next few hours were a blur of frantic searching and growing dread. We scoured the area around our camp, calling Jack's name until our voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of him, save for a scrap of his T-shirt we found snagged on a bush about 100 yards from the camp. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we were forced to face the reality of our situation. Jack was missing, we had no food, and something dangerous was clearly in the area. "We need to get help," Mike said, always the practical one. "Ooh, we should head back to the ranger station." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "What about Jack?" I swallowed hard, looking at the dense forest around us. "We can't help him if whatever took him comes back for us. We need to get the rangers." The hike back was tense and silent. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, hunted. We were about halfway back when we heard it again, that same unnatural howl from the night before. It was closer this time, much closer. Without a word, we broke into a run. We burst out of the tree line and into the ranger station parking lot, gasping for breath. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old man named Tom, took one look at our wild eyes and torn clothes and ushered us inside. As we recounted our story, I could see the color draining from Tom's face. When we finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the forest beyond. "You're not the first," he said finally, his voice low. "We've had other reports, sightings, things that don't make sense." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. "What kind of things?" Tom sighed heavily. "Tracks too big for any known animal. Livestock mutilations that can't be explained by normal predators, and disappearances." A chill ran down my spine. "Like Jack," he nodded grimly. "We've had 3 hikers go missing in the last month alone. Search and rescue found nothing." "So what is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's out there?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know. Some of the old-timers talk about legends, creatures that aren't supposed to exist. But I'm a man of science. I deal in facts. And the fact is, something is out there that we can't explain." The next few days were a whirlwind of search parties, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Jack's family flew in, their grief and confusion palpable. We scoured every inch of those woods, but found no trace of our friend. As the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. The official search was called off, though Jack's family hired private investigators to continue looking. They found nothing. It's been 6 months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, hearing that inhuman howl echoing in my dreams. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Sarah and Mike have tried to move on, to put that terrible weekend behind them, but I can't. I keep going over it in my mind, wondering if there was something we could have done differently, some way we could have saved Jack. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if Jack is still out there somewhere, lost in those mountains. Or worse, if whatever took him is still hunting, waiting for its next victim. I know the official report lists Jack as a probable victim of a bear attack. It's easier for people to accept that, to believe in a known danger rather than face the possibility of something other. But I know what I saw. Those claw marks were no bear. That howl was no wolf. And sometimes, when I look out at the mountains in the distance, I swear I can see something moving among the trees, something large and fast and not quite natural. I don't know what's out there in those woods, but I know it's real. And it's dangerous. And I can't help but feel that someday, somehow, I'll encounter it again. Until then, I'll keep telling our story, not just for Jack, but for anyone who might venture into those mountains, because they need to know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that shouldn't exist but do. And sometimes, when you venture into the wild places of the world, you might just come face to face with them. So if you're ever camping in the Cascades and you hear an unnatural howl in the night, don't dismiss it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know. You might be next. Story 4. The first thing that hit me was the silence, not the quiet of a typical wilderness, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that seemed to suck the sound out of the air. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, nothing but the faint crunch of our boots on the rocky trail. It wasn't right, and deep down, I knew it. We all knew it. It had been a routine climb at first. The 5 of us, my buddies and I, had been hiking together for years. We weren't amateurs. We knew how to handle the backcountry, and especially in places like this, where most people wouldn't dare go. The Lost Valley, they called it. A place so remote and untouched by modern civilization that only the most experienced climbers attempted the journey. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. But we brushed them off. Legends, folklore, nothing more than campfire tales meant to keep people away from these dangerous trails. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. And then John disappeared. It happened so fast. 1 minute, he was walking at the front of the group, laughing at some joke someone had made, and the next, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, nothing. 1 second he was there, and the next he wasn't. We stopped dead in our tracks, staring at the spot where he'd been, the cold realization that something was very wrong, settling over us like a heavy blanket. At first, we called his name, thinking maybe he'd wandered off the trail or slipped behind a tree to take a piss. But after a few minutes, our shouts grew more frantic, the edge of fear creeping into our voices. "John!" I shouted, cupping my hands around my mouth as if it would make a difference. "John, where the hell are you?" Nothing, not even an echo. Ryan, the most level-headed of the group, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "He can't have gone far. We would have heard something." He glanced around, scanning the trees as if John might suddenly materialize out of thin air. But the trees were thick, their branches tangled and dark, casting strange, shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. "We need to split up," I suggested, my voice tighter than I intended. "We'll cover more ground that way." Ryan hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Yeah, okay, but don't go too far. We meet back here in 10 minutes, whether we find him or not." We spread out, each of us taking a different direction, our flashlights sweeping through the underbrush as the last of the daylight faded. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved further from the group, every snap of a twig beneath my boots making me flinch. The silence was suffocating now, wrapping itself around me like a vice, and I found myself wishing for the sound of John's voice, or even just the familiar rustle of an animal moving through the brush, but there was nothing, just that same eerie, oppressive stillness. I hadn't gone more than 100 yards when I found the first set of footprints. They were massive, much too large to belong to John or any of us. At first, I thought they might be bear tracks, but as I crouched down to examine them more closely, I realized something was off. They were too narrow, too elongated, like something that walked upright. I could see the deep impressions of toes, splayed wide as if whatever made them was heavy, very heavy. A shiver crawled down my spine as I stood up, scanning the area around me. The tracks led off into the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. My gut told me to turn back, to get the hell out of there and find the others, but something else, curiosity maybe, or sheer stupidity, kept me rooted to the spot. I followed the tracks. The trees seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into the forest, the air growing colder with each step. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could feel the weight of the growing darkness pressing down on me. The tracks were fresh, the edges of the prints still crisp in the soft earth, and every instinct I had screamed at me that I was getting closer to something I didn't want to find. And then I smelled it. A foul, metallic stench hit me like a wave, making me gag. It was the smell of blood, thick and cloying, mixed with something else. Something rancid and decaying. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the forest ahead. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a tree, just another dark shape in the tangled mess of branches, but as my light flickered over it, I realized it was something else entirely, something massive. It stood just inside the tree line, half hidden in shadow, its hulking form almost blending in with the trunks around it. But I could see enough to know it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It was tall, easily 7, 8 feet, maybe more, and covered in thick matted fur. Its arms were long, too long, hanging down by its sides like it had no use for them. But it was the eyes that stopped me cold. They gleamed in the darkness, catching the light from my flashlight like a pair of glowing orbs, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was like nothing I'd ever heard of, nothing that should exist. I wanted to run, to scream for the others, but I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. All I could do was stand there, staring back at it, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. Then it moved. The creature stepped forward, its massive footfall barely making a sound despite its size. It moved with an unnatural grace, like it was floating rather than walking, and every instinct I had screamed at me to get the hell out of there. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me, branches slapping at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear it behind me, the sound of something massive crashing through the trees. But I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the trail, I was gasping for breath, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The others were already there, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they looked around, their faces pale and anxious. "Did you find him?" Ryan asked, his voice tight with fear. I shook my head, barely able to speak. "No, but there's something out there, something big." They didn't need me to explain. The fear in my voice must have said it all, because without another word, we packed up and left. We didn't stop until we reached the base of the mountain, our hearts still pounding, the weight of what we'd seen hanging heavy in the air. John was never found. We reported him missing. Of course, the search teams came out, combing the area for days, but they found nothing, no tracks, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. But I knew better. We all did. We didn't talk about it afterward. Not really. What could we say? No one would believe us if we tried to explain what we'd seen. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But every time I close my eyes, I can still see those glowing eyes staring back at me, that hulking figure looming in the shadows. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, watching, waiting. The Lost Valley may be forgotten by most, but whatever lives there hasn't forgotten us. Story 5. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I captured on my camera that fateful night in the Appalachian wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a week-long trek to document the local fauna. Instead, it became a nightmare that continues to haunt my every waking moment. The day had started like any other on this assignment. I'd woken before dawn, packed my gear, and set out into the misty forest. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the woods were alive with the rustle of small creatures and the occasional call of a bird. By mid-afternoon, I'd captured some decent shots of deer, a family of raccoons, and even a black bear at a safe distance. But I was hoping for something special, something that would make this trip stand out. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I decided to push a little further into the wilderness. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, something large weaving between the trees about 100 yards away. My heart raced with excitement. Could it be another bear, or perhaps an elusive mountain lion? I raised my camera, its powerful zoom lens allowing me to peer deep into the gathering shadows of the forest. Through the viewfinder, I caught glimpses of something moving, but it was frustratingly obscured by the dense foliage. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a normal predator in these parts. As the light faded, I switched to my night vision setup, determined not to lose sight of my quarry. That's when I got my first clear look, and my blood ran cold. The creature stood upright, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was covered in thick, matted fur with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the face that truly terrified me. A twisted amalgamation of human and animal features, with gleaming eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. My finger pressed the shutter button almost of its own accord, the camera's rapid-fire mode capturing a series of images in quick succession. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, and I saw the creature's head snap in my direction. For a moment, we stared at each other, man and beast, separated by 100 yards of darkening forest. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had any right to, melting into the shadows between one blink and the next. My heart pounding, I turned and ran, all thoughts of photography forgotten in my blind panic. I crashed through the underbrush, uncaring of the branches that whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear something large moving through the forest, keeping pace effortlessly. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when I finally burst out of the tree line and into the small clearing where I'd set up my camp, I was gasping for breath, my legs trembling with exertion. I dove into my tent, zipping it closed behind me, as if the thin fabric could offer any protection against the thing I'd seen. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I became aware of the oppressive silence that had fallen over the forest. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if the entire woodland was holding its breath. With shaking hands, I pulled out my camera and began to review the photos I'd taken. The first few showed only hints of movement, dark shapes among the trees. But as I flicked through them, the images became clearer, each one showing the creature closer than the last. The final image made my heart stop. There, filling the entire frame, were 2 glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth, captured in perfect clarity, just feet from where I must have been standing. I hadn't even realized it had gotten so close. A twig snapped outside my tent. I froze, barely daring to breathe. Something large moved around the perimeter of my campsite, its footsteps heavy enough to make the ground tremble slightly. I could hear deep, rhythmic breathing like the panting of a large dog. Then, to my horror, I saw the shadow of a massive hand fall across the side of my tent. Long, curved claws extended from each finger, easily capable of shredding through the thin fabric. I closed my eyes, certain that my last moments had come, but after what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved away. I heard more footsteps, growing fainter, and then silence returned to the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, my back pressed against my backpack, clutching my hunting knife in one hand and my camera in the other. Every sound, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I'd made it through the night, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. I packed up my camp in record time, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. As I shouldered my backpack and prepared to leave, a glint of something metallic caught my eye. There, hanging from a low branch at the edge of the clearing, was my watch. I'd worn it yesterday, but in my panic, I hadn't even noticed it was missing. Now it dangled there, the early morning sun glinting off its face like some kind of twisted offering. My hands shook as I unhooked it from the branch. The watch was intact, but the band was broken, as if it had been torn from my wrist with great force. And there, scored deep into the metal back of the watch, were 3 parallel claw marks. I ran faster and harder than I ever had in my life, not stopping until I reached my car parked at the trailhead. I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from the forest. It's been 3 months since that day, and I haven't taken a single photograph since. The camera sits in my closet, still holding the images from that night. I can't bring myself to look at them again, but I also can't bear to delete them. They're the only proof I have that what I experienced was real. I've thought about sharing the photos, about going public with what I saw, but who would believe me? And more importantly, would I be putting others in danger by drawing attention to whatever is living in those woods? So I keep silent, carrying the weight of what I know. But every night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I can't help but wonder about that creature. Is it still out there, roaming the Appalachian wilderness? Are there more like it? And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I swear I can hear a distant, inhuman howl carried on the wind. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that someday, somehow, I'll encounter it again. Because the truth is, once you've seen something like that, once you know what's really out there in the dark, you can never truly escape it. It becomes a part of you, a shadow that follows you wherever you go. So I wait, and I watch, and I pray that the next time our paths cross, I'll be ready. Because I know now that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. And sometimes they're the ones behind the camera, watching us. Story 6. It was supposed to be a simple night hike, just me and Mike, 2 friends eager to push ourselves a bit more, to feel that extra thrill of being out in the wilderness after dark. We'd done it plenty of times before, nothing serious, just walking the trails after sunset, letting the cool air and quiet woods clear our minds. But that night, things didn't feel right from the start. The air was colder than usual, biting even, and the silence wasn't the usual peaceful kind. It was heavy, almost oppressive. I remember thinking, even as we set out, that it felt wrong, like the forest itself didn't want us there. Mike didn't seem to notice, though. He was talking about work, or maybe it was football. I wasn't really listening. My mind was on the strange stillness around us, the way the trees seemed to loom taller in the dark. It felt like they were closing in, like the path we were walking was getting narrower with each step. I kept glancing at the shadows between the trees, expecting something to leap out at any moment. Then came the sound, a low, distant wail, barely audible at first, almost like the wind, but sharper, more purposeful. Mike stopped mid-sentence and looked at me, his face tense. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. I didn't have to ask if he was spooked. His expression said it all. The sound wasn't something you just brushed off. It was the kind of sound that made your stomach twist, that primal instinct kicking in, telling you to get the hell out of there. "Probably just an animal," I said, more for my own sake than his, but we both knew it wasn't any animal we were familiar with. We'd spent enough time out here to know the sounds of the forest, the owls, the coyotes, even the occasional bear grunt. This wasn't any of those. We kept walking, though, because what else were we going to do? Turn around because of some weird noise. We weren't that kind of hikers. But then the sound came again, this time closer. It was sharper, louder, more like a scream than a wail now. It echoed through the trees, making them seem even taller, like we were in some giant, endless forest rather than just a park we'd hiked through a dozen times before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my grip tightened on the flashlight in my hand. Mike stopped again, this time pulling his own flashlight from his pack. "What the hell is that?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, my pulse quickening. "But it's getting closer." For the first time that night, I was genuinely scared. Not just uneasy, but scared. It was like we weren't alone, like something was watching us from the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that sound, it wasn't just random, it felt like it had a purpose, like it was calling out for something, or someone. "We should head back," Mike finally said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. It matched my own. I didn't argue. I just turned around and started walking, faster than before. The path looked different now, twisted and unfamiliar, even though I knew it like the back of my hand. Every tree, every rock seemed wrong, out of place. The air felt colder, too, the temperature dropping with every step we took back toward the car. That's when we heard the footsteps, not ours, something else. It was faint at first, just a soft crunching in the leaves behind us, but as we sped up, so did the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, like whatever it was didn't care if we heard it. It was following us, and it wanted us to know. "Mike," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder. His face had gone pale, eyes wide as he glanced back too. "I hear it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Keep moving." We broke into a jog, trying to stay calm, but knowing deep down that we were being hunted. The footsteps grew louder, faster, matching our pace no matter how much we tried to speed up. And then the scream came again, that horrible, piercing wail that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. I wanted to run, to bolt into a full sprint, but something in me knew that wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, it was faster, stronger. If we ran, we'd be playing into its game. So we just kept moving, trying not to break into a full panic. Then the flashlight beam caught something, just for a second, a shape, tall and gangly, moving between the trees. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I saw enough to know that it wasn't human, not fully at least. It was hunched over, its limbs too long, its skin pale and almost glowing in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled. "Did you see it?" Mike's voice was urgent, almost frantic. I nodded, too scared to speak. I didn't want to look again, but I couldn't stop myself. I kept glancing over my shoulder, watching the shadows shift and twist as we hurried down the path. The footsteps hadn't stopped. If anything, they were closer now, almost in sync with our own. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. We both froze, the silence hitting us like a wave. It was like the forest had swallowed all sound again, leaving nothing but the pounding of our hearts in our ears. Mike turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping the trees. I did the same, my hand shaking as I tried to steady the beam. The path was empty, the woods were still, but I knew, deep in my gut, that it was out there, watching. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, something burst out of the trees to our left. It was fast, impossibly fast, a blur of movement that sent us both stumbling backward. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight rolling away, the beam flickering as it spun out of my reach. Mike shouted something, but I couldn't make out the words. My ears were ringing, my vision blurred. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I grabbed for the flashlight, the light weak and sputtering in the darkness. Then I saw it, full on this time. It was standing at the edge of the path, just a few yards away, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too thin, too long. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and almost translucent, like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. And its face, it didn't have one. Not really, just a gaping maw where a mouth should have been. And those eyes, those horrible, glowing eyes that seemed to bore into me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it took a step toward me. Its movements jerky, unnatural. The scream, it came from it. I knew that now, that awful, soul-piercing scream that had been haunting us for the last hour, and then it screamed again. The sound hit me like a physical force, knocking me backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp again. I hit the ground hard, gasping for breath as the scream echoed through the trees, reverberating inside my skull. I thought that was it. I thought I was done for. But then Mike grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Run!" he shouted, his voice hoarse, frantic. "We have to run!" And this time I did. We ran like hell, tearing down the path, not caring if it could keep up. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We just ran, faster than I thought possible. Our lungs burning, legs aching, but we didn't stop. The car was in sight now, just ahead. I could see it, parked at the edge of the lot, waiting like a beacon of safety. We reached it in seconds, throwing ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, gasping for breath, the silence pressing in around us once again. But this time, the silence was a relief. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands still shaking, and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as we drove away. I didn't need to, because I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been out there, it wasn't gone. It was still in the woods, waiting. Story 7. The moon was just starting to rise over the horizon when I saw it, something large, something fast, darting across the road ahead of me. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the way it moved, that wasn't right. No animal moved like that. It was quick, too quick, and the shape longer, more muscular than a deer. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I instinctively slowed down, eyes fixed on the spot where it had vanished into the trees. I wasn't supposed to be out here. It was late, and this stretch of road was deep in the middle of nowhere, cutting through a forest I'd driven through 100 times before. Normally, I didn't think twice about it. I'd grown up in these parts, and the woods were just the woods. Quiet, dark, lonely, sure, but familiar. Not tonight. Tonight, the air felt different. There was a chill to it, a stillness that felt unnatural. Even with the windows rolled up, I could feel it creeping in, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed the truck even more, scanning the road for any sign of movement, and then I saw it again. Whatever it was had reappeared, just off the side of the road, barely visible through the trees. My headlights caught the glint of something, eyes, maybe, reflecting back at me from the darkness. I hit the brakes, heart pounding in my chest. It was just standing there, partially hidden by the trees, but I could make out enough to know this wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. It was tall, easily 6 or 7 feet, maybe more, and it was standing on 2 legs. At first, I thought it was a person, but no human had arms that long, or a body built like that. The thing's head was wolf-like, its snout long and narrow, with pointed ears that stood straight up, catching the moonlight as it filtered through the branches. But it wasn't a wolf. It was too big, too upright, too wrong. I stared at it, frozen in place, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. For a second, neither of us moved. It just stood there, watching me, and I watched it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. This was something out of a nightmare, not real life. But there it was, standing no more than 20 yards from my truck, its eyes locked on mine. Then, in one fluid motion, it turned and vanished back into the trees, moving so fast it was like it had melted into the shadows. I blinked, trying to process what I'd just seen. My chest was tight, and my mouth had gone dry. I sat there for a few moments, my foot hovering over the gas pedal, unsure of what to do. I couldn't just sit here, waiting for it to come back, could I? I forced myself to breathe, in and out, my fingers trembling as I loosened my grip on the wheel. My heart was still racing, and my instincts were screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe. Stupidity, probably. I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with me yet. I slowly pressed down on the gas and edged the truck forward, my headlights sweeping across the trees as I crept down the road. I kept glancing to the side, half expecting to see it again, lurking just out of sight. But the forest was empty now. Quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the woods, crickets, wind, the occasional owl, were gone. The only sound was the low hum of the truck's engine and the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I'd driven maybe a quarter mile when I heard it. A loud thud, followed by a scraping sound that made my skin crawl. It was coming from behind me. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look. I knew what it was, even before I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature had followed me. In the dim glow of my taillights, I could see it. The thing was hunched over, running on all fours now, but its movements were unnervingly smooth, too fast for something its size, and it was gaining on me. Fast. I slammed on the gas, the truck lurching forward as I tried to put as much distance between me and whatever the hell that thing was. My tires skidded on the gravel as I sped down the road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't dare look back again. I just focused on the road ahead, praying the truck wouldn't break down or slide off into the ditch. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't just following me. It was right behind me. I could hear the sound of claws raking across the metal, feel the slight jolt as something hit the back of the truck. The thing was trying to get in. I swerved, trying to shake it off, but it was relentless, holding on even as I veered around a corner at nearly 50 miles an hour. I could hear it growling now, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. My mind raced. What was I supposed to do? There was no way I could outrun this thing, not on these winding roads, and stopping wasn't an option. I had to think of something, and fast. Then, just ahead, I saw it. The old bridge. It wasn't much, just a narrow span over a creek, but it gave me an idea. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I floored the gas, pushing the truck as fast as it would go, the bridge coming up fast. The creature was still clinging to the back, its claws scraping against the metal, but I could feel it slipping, losing its grip as the truck bounced over the uneven road. The bridge was just ahead now, only seconds away. I hit it hard, the truck rattling as I flew over the wooden planks. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost control. The tires skidded, and I fought to keep the truck steady as it careened toward the other side. But somehow, I made it across, and the creature didn't. I glanced in the rearview mirror just in time to see it tumble off the back of the truck, slamming into the wooden slats of the bridge before disappearing into the darkness below. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, the adrenaline surging through my veins as I put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I finally pulled over. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. I sat there for a long time, just staring out the windshield, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was that thing? I had no idea. But I knew one thing for sure. I'd never be driving that road again. Not at night. Not ever. When I finally got out of the truck, my legs were weak, barely able to hold me up. I walked around to the back, dreading what I might find. The tailgate was a mess. Deep gouges raked into the metal, some parts of it bent as if something massive had slammed into it. I touched one of the scratches, my fingers shaking as they traced the deep, jagged line. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. Whatever that thing was, it had been real. And it had been close, too close. I climbed back into the truck, my mind still reeling. I didn't know what I'd tell people when I got back. They wouldn't believe me anyway. Hell, I barely believed it myself, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I'd survived, and that whatever was out there in those woods, it wasn't done hunting, it was just waiting for its next chance. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the remote forests of northern Michigan. What started as a routine hunting trip with my buddies turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that we weren't the hunters that night. We were the prey. It was late October, prime time for deer hunting. My friends, Jake, Mike, and Tom, and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd found a secluded spot deep in the national forest, miles from the nearest road or campground. The kind of place where you could really lose yourself in the wilderness. We arrived at our destination just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and decaying leaves. As we set up our small cabin, an old trapper's shack we'd rented for the week, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. It was too quiet, no birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. "Feels like something's watching us, doesn't it?" Jake said, voicing my unspoken thoughts as we unloaded our gear. I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling. "And probably just some curious deer. We'll bag one of them tomorrow." We spent that first evening planning our hunt, poring over maps and discussing strategies over beers and a hearty stew. As the night wore on, the unease I'd felt earlier began to fade. This was just another hunting trip, nothing to worry about. How wrong I was. The trouble started in the middle of the night. I woke to the sound of something heavy moving around outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a bear, drawn by the scent of our food. But then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a low, rumbling growl unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I nudged Jake awake, pressing a finger to my lips to keep him quiet. We listened in tense silence as whatever it was circled the cabin. The floorboards creaked as Mike and Tom stirred in their bunks, awakened by the commotion. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his eyes wide in the darkness. Before I could answer, there was a tremendous crash from outside. It sounded like our truck being overturned. Then silence fell again, broken only by our ragged breathing. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the cabin, our rifles clutched close. None of us slept. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, we cautiously ventured outside. The scene that greeted us was one of destruction. Our truck lay on its side, the metal crumpled as if it had been hit by a wrecking ball. Deep gouges scored the earth around the cabin, and several trees bore claw marks far higher than any bear could reach. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, running a hand through his hair. "What could have done this?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years of hunting, I'd never seen anything like it. As we surveyed the damage, Jake called out from the edge of the clearing, "Guys, you need to see this." We hurried over to where he stood, staring at the ground. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any print I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe, and it was unmistakably bipedal. "That's not possible," Mike said, his voice shaking. "There's nothing in these woods that could make a print like that." But the evidence was right there in front of us, and worse, there was a clear trail of these prints leading off into the forest. We spent the next hour in heated debate. Mike and Tom wanted to hike out immediately, to alert the authorities, but our truck was totaled, and it was a long walk back to civilization. Jake and I argued that we should try to track whatever had done this. We were hunters, after all. This is what we did. In the end, we compromised. We'd follow the tracks, but only for a few hours. If we didn't find anything, we'd turn back and make for the ranger station. Armed with our rifles and what supplies we could carry, we set off into the forest. The trail was easy to follow at first, broken branches, disturbed earth, and those massive footprints leading the way. But as the day wore on, the signs became more subtle. Whatever we were tracking, it was clever. It knew how to move through the woods without leaving much of a trace. By mid-afternoon, we were deep in a part of the forest I'd never seen before. The trees here were old, gnarled things, their branches twisting together to block out much of the sunlight. The air felt thick and oppressive, and that eerie silence from the night before had returned. That's when we found the cave. It was nestled at the base of a rocky outcropping, half hidden by overgrown vines. The entrance was large enough for something big to comfortably pass through, and the ground around it was littered with bones. "We should go back," Tom said, his face pale. "This isn't right." Part of me agreed with him. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But another part, the hunter in me, wanted to see this through, to understand what we were dealing with. "We'll just take a quick look," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "In and out, 5 minutes tops." Reluctantly, the others agreed. We switched on our flashlights and entered the cave, rifles at the ready. The smell hit us first, a rank, musky odor that made my eyes water. As our lights swept the interior of the cave, I felt my heart skip a beat. The walls were covered in claw marks, some of them fresh. Piles of bones littered the floor, some animal, some disturbingly human-like. And there, at the back of the cave, was a crude nest made of branches and what looked like shredded clothing. "We need to go," Jake whispered urgently. "Now?" We turned to leave, but froze at the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the cave entrance. Something large was moving towards us, fast. In a panic, we scrambled deeper into the cave, ducking behind a large boulder. I gestured frantically for everyone to turn off their flashlights. In the pitch darkness, we heard it enter the cave. The sound of its breathing filled the space, deep, ragged breaths that sent chills down my spine. I could smell it now, that same musky odor, but stronger, closer. For what felt like hours, we sat there in terrified silence as the creature moved about the cave. I could hear it sniffing the air, no doubt catching our scent. More than once, I was sure it would discover our hiding spot, but eventually, mercifully, it left. We waited until we could no longer hear its footsteps before daring to move. "And what do we do now?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "We get the hell out of here, fast and quiet as we can." We emerged from the cave into the fading light of dusk. Without a word, we began to run, all thoughts of tracking or hunting forgotten. Our only goal now was survival. We ran through the night, stumbling through the dark forest, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. More than once, I heard that terrible growl in the distance, spurring us to greater speed. It was nearly dawn when we finally broke through the tree line and onto the main road. A passing trucker stopped for us, no doubt startled by our wild appearance and frantic gestures. We never went back to retrieve our gear or the wrecked truck. We gave statements to the local authorities, but I could tell they didn't believe us. How could they? Our story sounded insane even to my own ears. It's been 5 years since that hunt, and I haven't set foot in those woods since. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that growl, still smell that musky odor, and I wonder about what's out there, lurking in the dark places of the world. I used to be a hunter. Now, I know what it feels like to be hunted. And let me tell you, it's not a feeling I'll ever forget. So if you're ever in the forests of northern Michigan and you hear something moving in the undergrowth that sounds bigger than it should be, don't investigate. Don't try to track it. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because out there, in the wild places, there are things that hunt humans, and once they have your scent, they never forget it. Story 9. I never thought a quiet camping trip with a few friends could turn into a living nightmare. We'd planned the weekend as an escape, a way to unwind in the middle of nowhere and get away from our phones, work, and the chaos of everyday life. Just a few days under the stars, with nothing but the crackling of a fire and the soft murmur of the wind through the trees to keep us company. But as we settled into the remote clearing deep in the woods, the air felt different. Something was off, like the forest was holding its breath, watching us. It was the first night when things started to go wrong. The fire was dying down, casting flickering shadows across the trees surrounding our camp. The five of us, me, Chris, Emily, Jake, and Sarah, were sitting around, laughing and telling stories. The mood was light, the kind of easygoing atmosphere that comes from being out in the wilderness with friends you've known forever. But then, the noises started. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest, leaves rustling, the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But then it shifted. There was this low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, coming from the edge of the clearing. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was a bear or a coyote, but it didn't sound like either. It was deeper, more menacing. Chris was the first to notice. He tilted his head, his laughter fading as he strained to listen. Did you guys hear that?" We all fell silent, the crackling of the fire suddenly feeling too loud, too intrusive. Emily's eyes darted toward the tree line, but no one moved. "Probably just a bear," Jake said, though his voice was tight, uneasy. "It's nothing." But the growl came again, this time closer, louder. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the side of my chair. My heart was already starting to pick up speed, thudding in my chest, but I didn't want to seem like I was panicking. I aimed the beam of light toward the trees, sweeping it across the underbrush. Nothing. "Let's just get inside the tents," Sarah suggested, her voice small. "It's probably safer than being out here." "Yeah, maybe that's a good idea," I said, trying to sound calm, but even I could feel the anxiety creeping in. Something didn't feel right. We quickly doused the fire and retreated to our tents, each of us zipping up our shelter with a sense of urgency that none of us acknowledged out loud. Chris and I shared one tent, while the others split between two. As I lay there, the thin nylon walls of the tent doing little to make me feel secure, I could hear every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, amplified in the darkness. The growl was gone, but the unease remained, thick and heavy. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It wasn't the shuffling of feet or the sound of an animal rooting through our stuff. It was heavier than that, like something large brushing against the tents. My eyes flew open, heart immediately racing as I strained to listen. Beside me, Chris stirred. "You hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though he probably couldn't see me in the dark. My hand instinctively reached for the flashlight, but I hesitated. Whatever was out there, I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. The sound came again, this time, a low huff, like the breath of something big, too big. "Do you think it's a bear?" Chris whispered, but his tone told me he didn't believe that any more than I did. "I don't know," I whispered back, my mouth dry. I felt completely exposed, lying there with nothing but a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was outside. Suddenly, there was a sharp, scraping sound, like claws dragging across something solid. Then, a heavy thud right outside the tent. Chris and I both froze. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could barely breathe. The thing, whatever it was right there, just inches away from us. Slowly, I reached over and unzipped the tent a fraction of an inch, just enough to peek through. The fire had long since burned out, and the moonlight barely cut through the thick canopy above, but I could make out movement. Something tall, something hulking was moving between the tents, its shadow long and distorted in the dim light. I couldn't see details, but I could see enough to know it wasn't a bear. It was walking on two legs, hunched over, with long, thick arms that swung low at its sides. The sheer size of it was staggering, taller than a man, broader, with a kind of jerky, unnatural gait. Chris must have seen it too, because I felt him tense beside me. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I don't know," I whispered back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My body was screaming at me to do something, to move, to run, to hide. But I was frozen, locked in place by fear. The creature moved closer, circling the camp with slow, deliberate steps. It stopped near one of the tents, Sarah and Emily's, I realized, and crouched low, its massive form almost blending into the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was going to leave, that maybe it hadn't noticed us. But then it reached out, its long, clawed hand brushing against the fabric of the tent. The sound was deafening in the silence, the faint scraping of claws against nylon, the soft rasp of its breath. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Time seemed to stretch on forever, each second an eternity. And then, without warning, it stood up and moved on, disappearing into the trees as silently as it had come. Chris and I stayed perfectly still, listening to the sound of it moving away, until there was nothing but the usual night sounds of the forest. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, hearts pounding, too terrified to speak. Eventually, Chris broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said again, my voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here. Now!" We waited until the first light of dawn before we dared to move. No one had slept. When we finally crawled out of the tent, bleary-eyed and stiff, the others were already up, pale and shaken. "Did you hear it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," I said, glancing around the camp. Everything seemed untouched, just as we had left it the night before. But there, in the dirt, leading away from the tents, were the tracks. Massive, humanoid tracks with deep impressions where claws had sunk into the earth. "Is this some kind of joke?" Jake muttered, staring down at the tracks, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew it wasn't a joke. We all did. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "We pack up," Chris said, his voice steady for the first time since the night began. "We pack up, and we get the hell out of here." None of us argued. Within minutes, we had broken camp, stuffing our gear into our packs with a frantic urgency that none of us could hide. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see the creature again, watching us from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the trees, the silence, and the lingering feeling of being watched. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the thought that whatever it was, it had let us go, for now. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, our feet sore, our backs aching from the weight of our packs. The relief I felt when I saw my truck was overwhelming. We threw our gear into the back, piling into the cab without a word. As I started the engine, I caught one last glimpse of the forest, the tall trees swaying gently in the breeze, their branches casting long shadows across the ground, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something move. Something tall, something massive, just at the edge of the trees. But I didn't stop. I didn't want to know. Story 10. I've been an avid hiker for years, but nothing could have prepared me for that fateful day in the Rockies. What started as a challenging day hike turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but after what I experienced in that cave, I'm not so sure. It was supposed to be a simple out-and-back trail, challenging but doable for our group of 4 experienced hikers. Sarah, Mike, Tom, and I had tackled plenty of difficult trails before, but we'd never faced anything like this. The day started perfectly. Clear skies, a crisp autumn breeze, and the promise of breathtaking views at the summit. We set out early, our packs loaded with supplies for the day ahead. The first few miles were everything we'd hoped for, winding trails through dense pine forests, babbling streams, and glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. But as we climbed higher, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, obscuring the mountaintops and bringing with them a biting wind. We paused to reevaluate our plans. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, eyeing the approaching storm warily. Tom shook his head. "We're more than halfway there. It'd take just as long to go back as to push on to the summit." I checked my GPS. He was right. We'd covered a lot of ground already. "Let's keep going," I decided, "but we'll reassess at the next waypoint." It was a decision I'd come to regret. Within an hour, the storm hit us full force. Rain lashed at us sideways, driven by howling winds that threatened to knock us off our feet. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted. We huddled together, shouting to be heard over the wind. "We need to find shelter," Mike yelled, his words nearly lost in the gale. I fumbled with my GPS, but the screen was dark. The battery must have died in the cold. Without it, in the whiteout conditions, I had no idea which way led back to the trail. We stumbled forward, one hand on the person in front, fighting against the wind with every step. That's when Tom spotted it, a dark opening in the rocky mountainside, a cave. Without hesitation, we made for it. As we entered, the howling of the wind faded, replaced by the sound of water dripping from our soaked clothes. We switched on our headlamps, illuminating our temporary refuge. The cave was deeper than it had first appeared, stretching back into darkness. The floor was littered with small bones and what looked like animal pelts. A musty, acrid smell hung in the air. "At least we're out of the storm," Sarah said, wringing water from her hair. Mike nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Yeah, but what made all this?" He gestured at the bones scattered around us. "They're probably just wolves or mountain lions," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's get further in, away from the entrance. We don't want to risk hypothermia." We moved deeper into the cave, our lights casting long shadows on the rough walls. That's when we noticed the markings, crude, primitive drawings etched into the stone. They depicted stick figures hunting what looked like elk or deer, but there was something off about the hunters. They were too tall, too lanky, with elongated limbs and oversized heads. "Guys," Tom whispered, his voice tight with fear, "I don't think we're alone in here." Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed from the depths of the cave. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. The sound raised the hair on the back of my neck and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. We froze, barely daring to breathe. In the silence that followed, we could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the reach of our lights. Something big. "We need to get out of here," Sarah hissed, already backing towards the cave entrance. But as we turned to leave, there was a thunderous crack from outside. The storm had brought down part of the mountainside, partially blocking the cave entrance. We were trapped. Panic set in. Mike rushed to the fallen rocks, trying to shift them, but they were too heavy. Tom joined him, but it was no use. We were cut off from the outside world. Another growl, closer this time. We whirled around, pressing our backs against the cool cave wall. Our lights swept the cavern, catching glimpses of movement in the shadows. And then we saw it. It emerged from the darkness like something from a nightmare. Easily 8 feet tall, with long, gangly limbs and matted fur covering its body. Its face was a twisted parody of human features, with sunken eyes that reflected our light like a cat's, and a mouth full of sharp, yellowed teeth. For a moment, we all stood frozen in mutual shock, us staring at this impossible creature, and it regarding us with what seemed like curious hostility. Then it let out a roar that shook loose stones from the cave ceiling, and chaos erupted. We scattered, running deeper into the cave in blind panic. I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls behind us, accompanied by that terrifying growl. The cave branched off in multiple directions, and in our fear, we became separated. I found myself alone in a narrow passage, my heart pounding in my ears. I switched off my headlamp, hoping the darkness would hide me. For what felt like hours, I crouched there, barely breathing, listening to the sounds of the creature moving through the cave system. Occasionally, I'd hear one of my friends cry out in the distance, the sound echoing off the cave walls until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Each time, my heart clenched, wondering if that was the last sound they'd ever make. As my panic slowly subsided, replaced by a grim determination to survive, I began to think more clearly. This creature, whatever it was, knew the cave system. It had the advantage here. Our only hope was to somehow make it back to the entrance and try to clear the fallen rocks. Slowly, carefully, I began to retrace my steps. Every sound made me freeze. certain that the creature was about to find me. But gradually, I made my way back towards where we'd entered. As I approached the cave entrance, I heard whispered voices. My heart leapt. My friends had had the same idea. I rounded a corner to find Sarah and Tom huddled near the blocked entrance. Mike was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Mike?" I whispered as I joined them. Sarah shook her head, tears in her eyes. "We don't know. We heard him scream earlier, but then nothing." We all knew what that likely meant, but none of us wanted to say it out loud. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice hoarse. "I think I can see light through some of these rocks. If we work together, maybe we can make an opening." For the next hour we worked in tense silence, shifting rocks and widening the gap. All the while we could hear the creature moving in the cave behind us, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and we were definitely the mice. Finally, we managed to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by the rain. We stumbled out into the fading daylight, gulping in the fresh air, but our relief was short-lived. As we stood there, catching our breath, a roar echoed from the cave. The creature had realized its prey was escaping. "Run!" I yelled, and we took off down the mountainside. We ran like we'd never run before, slipping on wet rocks and crashing through underbrush. Behind us, we could hear the creature in pursuit, its inhuman speed allowing it to gain on us, despite our head start. It was pure luck that we stumbled onto the trail. Without slowing, we followed it, our legs burning with exhaustion but fear spurring us on. It wasn't until we heard voices, other hikers, that we finally slowed. The creature, it seemed, was unwilling to venture this close to other humans. As we reached the group of startled hikers, we looked back to see a large, dark shape retreating into the forest. The authorities searched for Mike, but found no trace of him. They didn't believe our story about the creature, attributing our wild tale to the trauma of being lost in the storm. The official report listed Mike as missing, presumed dead from exposure or a fall. But we know the truth. Something is out there in those mountains, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a distant, inhuman howl carried on the wind. I don't hike anymore. The wilderness has lost its appeal. Because now I know that sometimes, when you venture into the wild, you might find yourself becoming prey to something that defies explanation. And not everyone makes it back to tell the tale. Story 11. The air was crisp, almost biting, as I set off down the trail. My heart was pounding with the thrill of the run, feet hitting the packed dirt in a steady rhythm, the cold air filling my lungs. It was just me, the trees, and the trail stretching out in front of me, winding deeper into the forest. I'd done this run a dozen times, same route, same time of year. It was a remote trail, far from the usual weekend hikers. And that's exactly why I loved it. But tonight, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. The woods seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier. No rustling of animals in the underbrush, no distant calls of birds settling down for the night, just an eerie, oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. I told myself it was the coming cold front, that maybe the animals were hunkering down early, but as I ran deeper into the forest, that gnawing sense of unease only grew stronger. The trail twisted ahead of me, disappearing into the dense woods, and that's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved, fast, just a flicker of motion, but enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I slowed down, my heart pounding harder now, more out of fear than exertion. I stopped completely, pulling out my earbuds and listening, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. Nothing. I scanned the trees, my breath fogging in the cold air. The shadows between the trees seemed darker, denser than before, but there was no sign of movement, just the same thick silence that had been hanging in the air all evening. I shook my head, forcing myself to relax. It was probably a deer, maybe a coyote, nothing unusual for this area. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and started running again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The trail narrowed, winding through a section of thicker trees, and that's when I heard it. A twig snapping off to my left. I stopped again, my skin prickling. It wasn't a small sound, like a squirrel or a bird. This was something bigger, something heavy. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees, but the shadows seemed to blur together in the fading light. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees themselves, let alone anything hiding in the underbrush. "Hello!" I called out, feeling a little ridiculous. My voice sounded too loud in the silence, almost hollow. There was no answer, just the same oppressive quiet pressing in from all sides. I started running again, faster this time, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. The trail stretched out in front of me, winding and twisting, but the trees on either side seemed to close in, like they were watching, waiting. I pushed the thought away, focusing on the rhythm of my feet hitting the ground, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I heard it again. This time, closer, footsteps, unmistakable, crunching through the leaves just off the trail. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but something heavier, and it was moving fast, parallel to me. I didn't stop to look. I didn't even think. I just ran. My feet pounded the ground, the sound of my breathing loud and ragged in my ears. Whatever was out there was moving too, keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I could hear it now, the crunch of leaves, the snap of branches, like it was stalking me, matching my speed. Panic surged through me, my chest tightening as I pushed myself harder, running faster than I'd ever run before. I could barely see the trail anymore, the shadows blurring as the trees whipped past me. The sound of the footsteps was louder now, closer. It wasn't just following me, it was chasing me. I glanced over my shoulder just for a second and saw it, a dark shape moving between the trees, too fast to make out any details but big, much bigger than a person. It was low to the ground, running on all fours, but it wasn't an animal. Its movements were wrong, too smooth, too deliberate, like it was hunting. Fear hit me like a freight train. I sprinted down the trail, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The sound of the creature crashing through the woods grew louder, closer. I could hear its breath now, heavy and ragged, almost a growl. I wasn't going to make it. I could feel it gaining on me, closing the distance with every step. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, anything that might help me get away, but there was nothing. Just the trail ahead and the thing behind me, hunting me like I was prey. Suddenly, the trail split, branching off to the right and left. I didn't have time to think. I veered left, hoping it would throw the creature off, buy me a few more seconds, but it didn't. The thing followed, crashing through the trees like a freight train, its growl turning into a snarl. I pushed myself harder, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The trail was narrow now, the trees too close on either side, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear it right behind me, so close I could almost feel its breath on the back of my neck. Then, without warning, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and I stumbled to a stop, gasping for air. I spun around, ready to face whatever was coming, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. But the creature was gone. The woods were silent again, the oppressive quiet settling back over the clearing like a shroud. My chest heaved as I scanned the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It couldn't have just disappeared. I had felt it, heard it. It had been right behind me, but now there was nothing. Just the stillness of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Slowly, I backed up, my legs still trembling, my pulse still hammering in my ears. I didn't take my eyes off the tree line, half expecting the thing to come crashing back out of the woods at any moment, but nothing came. I turned and started walking, my footsteps slow and cautious at first, then faster as the fear crept back in. I didn't care about finishing the run anymore. I just needed to get out of the woods. The trail felt longer on the way back, every rustle of leaves making my heart leap into my throat. My body was on high alert, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to walk, listening for any sign of the creature. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the trailhead up ahead, my car parked just beyond it. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. There, beside my car, were the tracks. Huge, clawed footprints, like nothing I'd ever seen before. They circled the vehicle, deep gouges in the dirt where the creature had walked. My stomach twisted, and I took a step back, my hands shaking as I stared at the prints. It had followed me. I unlocked the car with shaking hands, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. I didn't look back as I started the engine, my heart still racing as I sped down the road, away from the trail, away from whatever had been hunting me. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the thing was still out there, waiting, and the next time I came back, it wouldn't just let me go. Story 12. I've been a wildlife guide for over 2 decades, leading tourists through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrains North America has to offer. I've encountered my fair share of bears, wolves, and mountain lions. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what we encountered that day in the remote wilderness of Alaska. It was supposed to be a routine bear-watching tour. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The morning started like any other. I met my group of 6 eager tourists at the small lodge where we'd be based for the week. There was a retired couple from Florida, a young photographer from New York, and a family of 3 from Germany. They were all excited, cameras at the ready, to see some of Alaska's famous brown bears in their natural habitat. As we loaded up our gear into the rugged ATV that would take us deep into bear country, I gave my usual safety briefing. Remember, folks, we're entering their territory. We need to be respectful and cautious. Stay close, follow my instructions, and we'll all have a great time. We set off just as the sun was starting to burn off the morning mist, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. The ATV bounced along the rough trail, surrounded by towering pines and the distant snow-capped peaks of the Alaskan range. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wild berries. After about an hour's drive, we reached our destination, a scenic overlook of a wide, salmon-filled river where bears often came to feed. I helped everyone set up their equipment, and we settled in to wait. It wasn't long before we spotted our first bear, a large male, probably around 800 pounds, ambling along the riverbank. The tourists were thrilled, snapping photos and whispering excitedly. I smiled, always happy to see people connecting with nature. But as I scanned the area with my binoculars, something caught my eye. There, in a small clearing about a quarter-mile upstream, was a scene that made my blood run cold. At first glance, it looked like a bear had made a kill. There was a large, dark shape hunched over what appeared to be the carcass of a moose. But as I focused my binoculars, I realized something was terribly wrong. The bear was far too large, easily 12 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. Its fur was patchy and matted, hanging off its body in clumps. And its face, God! Its face was all wrong. The snout was too short, the eyes too forward-facing, almost human-like in their placement. I lowered my binoculars, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe I was more tired than I thought. "Is everything okay?" the young photographer asked, noticing my distress. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just thought I saw something unusual. Probably nothing." But when I looked back through my binoculars, the creature was still there, and now it was looking directly at us. My heart raced as I watched it drop the half-eaten moose and begin to move in our direction. Its gait was all wrong for a bear, too upright, too purposeful. "All right, folks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to pack up and head back to the ATV. Now!" the tourists protested, confused by the sudden change of plans. But something in my tone must have conveyed the urgency, because they began gathering their gear without too much argument. As we hurried back to the vehicle, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The creature was moving faster now, covering ground at an alarming rate. It was then that I made a terrible realization. We weren't going to make it to the ATV in time. "Change of plans," I said, my mind racing. "There's a ranger station about a half-mile east of here. We're going to head there on foot. Stay close, move fast, and whatever you do, don't look back." We set off at a brisk pace, the confused and frightened tourists struggling to keep up. I could hear it behind us now, the sound of branches snapping under heavy footfalls, and a low, rumbling growl that was like no bear I'd ever heard. The half-mile to the ranger station felt like a marathon. My lungs burned, and I could hear the labored breathing of the others behind me. The retired man from Florida was struggling, and his wife was half supporting him as they ran. Just when I thought we couldn't go any further, the ranger station came into view. It was a small, sturdy log cabin with a radio antenna on the roof. Safety was just yards away. That's when I heard the scream. I spun around to see the German teenager had tripped and fallen, and there, emerging from the tree line, was the creature. In the full light of day, it was even more terrifying. It stood on two legs, its massive frame covered in patchy brown fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a grotesque mixture of bear and human features, with intelligent, predatory eyes that fixed on the fallen teenager. Without thinking, I ran back, yelling at the top of my lungs and waving my arms. The creature hesitated, seemingly surprised by my actions. It was all the time we needed. I helped the teenager to his feet, and we made a final sprint for the ranger station. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us. The retired man from Florida collapsed into a chair, clutching his chest. The others were in various states of panic and exhaustion. I rushed to the radio, praying it was working. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Guide Thomas Parker at Outpost 17. We are under attack by an unknown animal. Request immediate evacuation." The radio crackled to life. "This is Ranger Base. Can you describe the animal?" I hesitated. How could I describe what I'd seen without sounding insane? It's like a bear, but bigger, much bigger, and it's not moving like a normal bear. Please, we need help now. "Understood. Helicopter is on its way. ETA 20 minutes. Stay inside and—" The radio cut off as something heavy slammed against the side of the cabin. The walls shook, and I heard wood splintering. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. The creature circled the cabin, occasionally charging at the walls or trying to break through the reinforced windows. We huddled in the center of the room, the tourists crying quietly while I tried to keep everyone calm. Just when I thought the walls would give way, we heard the blessed sound of helicopter rotors. The creature let out a roar of frustration and retreated into the forest as the chopper landed in the small clearing next to the station. We were evacuated safely, but the nightmare wasn't over. The authorities didn't believe our story about the creature. They attributed the damage to the station to a large, aggressive bear. The tourists' shaky video footage was dismissed as a hoax or a misidentified known animal. But I know what I saw, and I'm not the only one. Over the next few months, there were more sightings. Hunters found half-eaten prey too large for normal bears to take down. Rangers reported strange tracks and eerie howls in the night. The area where we encountered the creature has since been closed to the public, officially due to aggressive bear activity. But rumors persist of a government cover-up, of something out there that science can't explain. I don't lead tours anymore. The wilderness has lost its appeal for me, because now I know that sometimes, when you venture into the wild, you might encounter something that defies explanation, something that reminds us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. And somewhere out there, in the vast Alaskan wilderness, that creature is still roaming, waiting, watching, and I can't help but wonder, what if it's not the only one? Story 13. I never imagined that a weekend trip into the mountains would end with one of us missing. I've been on countless camping trips, led more hikes than I can count, and spent more time in the wilderness than I ever did at home. I knew the trails, the valleys, the peaks, all of it like the back of my hand, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in that remote mountain range. John vanished without a trace, and the terror that followed us afterward. Well, I'm still trying to make sense of it. We'd set out early that Friday morning, 5 of us, all good friends, John, Kyle, Erin, Jake, and me. The plan was simple: hike into the mountains, camp for a few nights, and enjoy some isolation before the weather turned too cold for trips like these. The Lost Valley, as the locals called it, was perfect for this sort of thing. Hard to get to, and once you're there, you rarely see anyone else. It was exactly what we wanted, just us and the wilderness. The first day was perfect. The weather was crisp, clear skies, and the scenery breathtaking. By the time we reached the valley and set up camp, we were exhausted but happy. That night, we sat around the campfire, trading stories and laughing, the flames flickering against the dark silhouettes of the towering pines around us. But as the fire started to die down, something changed. I couldn't place it at first. It was just a feeling, a prickling on the back of my neck like someone was watching us. The laughter quieted, and the 5 of us sat there in an uneasy silence, staring into the flames. Even the usual nighttime sounds, the wind in the trees, the chirping of crickets, seemed to fade away, replaced by a heavy stillness. Anyone else feel off? John broke the silence, his voice low. Kyle laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're just freaked out because we're in the middle of nowhere, man." John shrugged, glancing toward the trees. "Maybe, but it feels like something's out there." We all exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said anything. Finally, Erin stood up, brushing off her pants. "I'm heading to bed," she said. "We're just creeping ourselves out." "It's fine." One by one, we retreated to our tents, the unease lingering as we settled into our sleeping bags. I could hear the others shifting around in their tents, restless, but eventually everything went quiet. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, that same uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my pulse quicken, but exhaustion eventually dragged me into sleep. I woke to silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating and unnatural. No wind, no animals, just dead, still air. My watch told me it was just after dawn, but the light filtering through the tent seemed muted, like the world itself had dimmed. And that's when I realized something was wrong. John's tent was empty. I crawled out of my tent, the cold morning air biting at my skin. Kyle, Jake, and Erin were already up, standing by the edge of the camp, staring out into the woods. "Where's John?" I asked, pulling my jacket tighter. "He's gone," Erin said, her voice tight. "His pack's still here, but he's gone." The blood drained from my face. "What do you mean, gone? He wouldn't just leave." Kyle was pacing, his hands on his hips. "We've been calling for him for the past 10 minutes. There's no answer. No sign of him." We fanned out, searching the area around the camp, calling John's name until our voices were hoarse. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of a struggle. It was like he'd just disappeared into thin air. By midday, panic had set in. The 4 of us regrouped at the camp, our faces pale, eyes wide with fear. The rational part of me tried to stay calm. People get lost in the woods all the time. Maybe he'd wandered off to explore before we woke up and got turned around. But that gnawing feeling in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. Kyle and I decided to split up and search deeper into the forest, while Erin and Jake stayed behind in case John returned. We agreed to meet back at the camp by sunset. With my flashlight in hand and my heart pounding, I set off, my footsteps crunching against the cold, dry leaves that covered the ground. The deeper I went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the pale daylight. I called John's name every few minutes, but each time my voice echoed back at me, empty and hollow. The woods were unnervingly quiet, no birds, no insects, just my own breathing and the sound of my boots on the forest floor. After what felt like hours, I stumbled across something strange. A set of footprints, massive, deep impressions in the dirt, far larger than any human or animal tracks I'd ever seen. They weren't shaped like bear prints or any other animal I knew. They looked almost human, but the size was impossible, and they were spaced too far apart, like whatever made them was enormous. A chill ran down my spine as I crouched down to examine them. The edges were fresh, the soil still disturbed. Something had passed through here recently, something big. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. Not without John. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, my heart racing with each step. The prints led me to a clearing, a wide, open space where the trees thinned out. The ground was littered with broken branches, as if something massive had torn through here. But there was no sign of John, no blood, no clothes, nothing. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl vibrating through the air like thunder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came from somewhere just beyond the clearing, hidden in the dense trees. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but I saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I was being watched. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running would only make it worse. I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement, and then I saw it. Just beyond the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, something was standing there. Tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette towering above the bushes and trees. Its shape was wrong, distorted, like a man, but too large, too hunched, with long arms that hung low to the ground. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The growl rumbled again, deep and menacing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted back through the trees, the branches whipping at my face. The growling didn't follow me, but I didn't stop until I was back at camp, my lungs burning, my legs trembling. Kyle, Erin, and Jake were there, their faces pale with fear. They hadn't found John. There had been no sign of him, and when I told them what I'd seen, the tracks, the growl, the figure in the trees, well, we all knew what it meant. John wasn't coming back. We packed up in record time, none of us daring to look too long at the darkening woods around us. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rustling of our frantic movements as we stuffed our gear into our packs. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched, like that thing, whatever it was out there, waiting for us to leave. We hiked out of the valley as fast as we could, none of us speaking. The air grew colder as the sun set, the sky darkening overhead, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. It wasn't until we reached the trailhead, breathless and exhausted, that we finally let out a collective sigh of relief. But even as we drove away, the valley shrinking into the distance behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever had taken John was still out there, watching, waiting for its next victim. And as much as I tried to forget, the memory of those massive footprints and that low, menacing growl stayed with me. Even now, when the wind howls through the trees outside my window, I can still hear it, that deep guttural sound, echoing in the back of my mind. Whatever it was still out there, and I have no doubt that it will strike again. Story 14. The day I almost died on Crater Lake is a day I'll never forget. What started as a peaceful fishing trip turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. I've been a fisherman all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for what lurked beneath those pristine blue waters. It was a crisp autumn morning when my buddy Mike and I set out on Crater Lake. The water was like glass, reflecting the surrounding cliffs and forests in perfect detail. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to try our luck in one of Oregon's most beautiful and mysterious bodies of water. Our small motorboat cut through the calm surface as we made our way to a spot Mike swore was teeming with fish. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. Little did we know, the adventure we were about to have was nothing like what we'd imagined. We dropped anchor in a secluded cove, the sheer cliffs rising around us like nature's own amphitheater. The depth finder showed we were over about 300 feet of water, not unusual for Crater Lake, known for its extreme depths. "This is the spot," Mike said, grinning as he baited his hook. "I bet you a beer I catch the first fish." I laughed, following suit. "You're on, buddy." For the first hour or so, everything was perfect. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming our faces as we cast our lines into the deep blue water. We caught a few decent-sized trout, ribbing each other good-naturedly about who was the better fisherman. It was just after noon when things started to get weird. I noticed it first, a strange ripple in the water about 50 yards from our boat. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, not like the usual disturbance caused by fish or wind. "Hey, Mike," I said, nodding towards the ripple. "You see that?" He squinted against the sun's glare on the water. "Huh, weird. Maybe it's a school of fish." But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe it. The ripple was growing larger, moving towards us with purpose. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool air. Suddenly, our depth finder went crazy. The display, which had been steadily showing 300 feet, now flickered wildly between 300 and 100 feet. "What the hell?" Mike muttered, tapping the device. "Thing must be broken." But I wasn't looking at the depth finder anymore. My eyes were fixed on the water, where something massive was rising from the depths. At first, all I could see was a dark shape, indistinct but undeniably huge. Then, breaking the surface with barely a splash, emerged the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. It was a head, if you could call it that, easily the size of our boat. It was covered in thick, greenish-black scales that glistened in the sunlight. Two enormous eyes, yellow with slitted pupils like a cat's, blinked at us with unmistakable intelligence. A mouth large enough to swallow us whole opened slightly, revealing rows of teeth that looked sharp enough to shred metal. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Mike and I stared at the creature, and it stared right back at us. I could hear Mike's ragged breathing, smell the fishy stench emanating from the beast, feel my own heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Mike screamed, "Start the engine! Now!" I snapped into action, dropping my fishing rod and lunging for the ignition. The creature, apparently startled by the sudden movement or noise, let out a roar that shook the very air around us. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, part bellow, part hiss, all terror. The engine sputtered to life just as the monster began to move. A long, serpentine neck rose from the water, revealing that what we had seen was just the tip of the iceberg. This thing was enormous, its body creating waves that rocked our small boat dangerously. I gunned the engine, steering us towards the open water of the lake. Behind us, I could hear the creature giving chase, its massive body cutting through the water with frightening speed. "It's gaining on us!" Mike yelled, his eyes wide with fear as he looked back. I pushed the throttle as far as it would go, our little boat bouncing dangerously over the waves. The shore seemed impossibly far away. I weaved left and right, trying to throw off our pursuer, but it matched our movements with eerie precision. Just when I thought we might make it, there was a tremendous impact from below. The creature had dived and struck our boat from underneath, nearly capsizing us. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking us and flooding the bottom of the boat. "We're not going to make it," I realized aloud, watching as the shore grew no closer despite our speed. That's when Mike did something either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He grabbed our gaff hook, a long pole with a sharp, curved hook on the end used for landing large fish, and stood up in the rocking boat. "What are you doing?" I shouted over the roar of the engine and the creature's bellows. "Buying us time!" he yelled back, as the creature surfaced again, its massive jaws opening to engulf our boat. Mike struck. He jammed the gaff hook right into one of its eyes with all his strength. The monster reared back, letting out a shriek of pain that sent birds flying from the distant shore. "Go, go, go!" Mike screamed, nearly falling overboard as he stumbled back into his seat. I didn't need to be told twice. With the creature momentarily distracted, I steered us towards the nearest shore, praying our engine would hold out. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and adrenaline. I could hear the creature thrashing behind us, but I didn't dare look back. All my focus was on getting us to shore, to safety. Finally, blessedly, we reached the shallows. I drove the boat right up onto the pebbly beach, the keel grinding against the rocks. Mike and I leapt out, stumbling and falling in our haste to get away from the water. We turned back just in time to see the creature pause at the edge of the deep water. It rose up, towering over us, water cascading off its scaly body. For a moment, I was sure it would come after us on land, but then, with one last ear-splitting roar, it sank back into the depths, leaving only churning waters and waves lapping at the shore as evidence of its existence. Mike and I collapsed on the beach, gasping for breath, our minds reeling from what we'd just experienced. We stayed there for hours, unable to move, unable to fully process what had happened. When we finally gathered ourselves enough to seek help, no one believed our story. The authorities attributed our wrecked boat and wild tale to alcohol, despite our protests that we'd been stone-cold sober. Our claims were dismissed as a hoax or a hallucination, but we know what we saw. In the years since I've done research, reached out to others who've had strange experiences on Crater Lake. There are whispers, stories told in hushed tones about something living in the lake's depths, something ancient, something that's been there since long before humans came to these shores. I don't fish anymore, especially not in deep lakes. The thrill of the catch has been replaced by a bone-deep fear of what might be lurking beneath the surface. Because now I know that sometimes, in the remote corners of the world, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we are not always at the top of the food chain, and somewhere out there, in the cold, dark depths of Crater Lake, that creature is still swimming, waiting, watching, and I can't help but wonder, what else is out there that we don't know about? Story 15. The first thing that hit me as we descended into the cave was the smell, a sharp, metallic stench, like blood mixed with something rotten, hanging thick in the air. It was overpowering, cutting through the usual damp, earthy scent of underground spaces. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight deeper into the tunnel, the beam bouncing off the wet, slick walls. This wasn't the smell of animal droppings or decaying leaves. This was something else. Something wrong. Jesus, Dan muttered from behind me, coughing into his sleeve. What the hell is that? I don't know, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it's fresh. We stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that surrounded us. No dripping water, no distant echoes, nothing. Just a suffocating stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We weren't supposed to be here. This cave wasn't on any map, and as far as we knew, no one else had been inside before us. We'd stumbled across the entrance 2 days earlier while hiking through the northern woods, the ground giving way to reveal a hidden fissure. It was small, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but curiosity got the better of us. We'd explored dozens of caves before, and the excitement of discovering something new had outweighed the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that we should leave this one alone. That feeling was getting harder to ignore. "You sure about this, Sam?" Dan asked, his voice low, as if he didn't want to disturb the silence around us. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure. The air was thick with something that felt wrong, not just the smell, but the heaviness, like the cave itself was warning us to turn back. But we'd come this far, and I wasn't about to admit I was scared. "Yeah," I said finally, forcing myself to keep walking. "We're already down here. Let's see where it leads." Dan didn't argue, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. His footsteps were hesitant as he followed me deeper into the tunnel, the light from our flashlights cutting through the inky darkness. The cave twisted and turned, narrowing at points until we had to crouch to get through, then opening up again into wide, cavernous spaces. But the further we went, the worse the smell became, and the quieter everything got. It wasn't long before we stumbled across the first set of bones. They were small, scattered across the floor of a wide chamber. I knelt down, shining my light over them, and my stomach churned. Some were broken, gnawed at the edges, as if something had been feeding on them, but they weren't animal bones. Not entirely. There was something off about them, too delicate, too human-like. Are those? Dan trailed off, his voice shaky. I don't know, I said, standing up quickly, wiping my hands on my pants. Let's keep moving. We pressed on, but the unease was growing with every step. The tunnel ahead sloped downward, the walls slick with moisture, and the air grew colder as we descended. I kept my flashlight trained on the path ahead, but in the corner of my vision, shadows seemed to shift and move, like something was watching us from just beyond the beam of light. Do you hear that? Dan whispered suddenly, stopping in his tracks. I froze, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, just the sound of our own breathing, the faint rustle of our movements. But then, faint and far off, there was something else, a scraping sound like metal against stone. It echoed through the tunnel, slow and deliberate. I swallowed hard, glancing at Dan. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. We should go back, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to agree. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of this place. But something inside me pushed me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or pride. I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. We've come this far, I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to me. Let's just see what's down there. Dan looked like he wanted to argue, but after a long pause, he nodded reluctantly. We continued down the sloping tunnel, the sound of scraping growing louder with each step. It wasn't constant, more like something was dragging metal across the stone in slow, measured intervals, and with it came another sound, faint at first, barely audible but growing as we got closer. It was breathing, not the steady, rhythmic sound of an animal at rest, but a harsh, ragged gasping like whatever was making it was struggling for air. I could hear it now, echoing through the tunnel, coming from somewhere just ahead. I stopped, shining my flashlight down the path. The tunnel opened up into another chamber, larger than the others, the walls streaked with some kind of dark, wet substance that glistened in the light. And in the middle of the chamber, half hidden by shadows, was a pile of bones. Not small, scattered bones like before. These were larger, ribs, vertebrae, skulls, and there were dozens of them, piled in a heap like discarded trash. And crouched over the pile, barely visible in the dim light, was something else. At first, I thought it was a person, but as my flashlight beam landed on it, I realized how wrong I was. It was humanoid, yes, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched thin over its bones. It was hunched over the pile of remains, its long, bony fingers picking through the bones with unsettling precision, and its eyes, God, its eyes, were huge, black and glassy, reflecting the light like an animal caught in headlights. For a moment, I couldn't move. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, to make sense of the creature crouched in front of us. But then it moved. Slowly, it turned its head toward us, its mouth opening in a slow, deliberate grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. The breathing stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the chamber. Sam, Dan's voice trembled behind me. We need to go. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back up the tunnel. I could hear Dan right behind me, his footsteps echoing through the narrow space, but I could also hear something else. That same scraping sound, only faster now, more frantic, and behind it, the growl, louder, angrier. We didn't stop, didn't look back. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, the air growing colder with every step. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Not with that thing behind us. Finally, I saw it. The faint glimmer of daylight up ahead, filtering through the narrow opening we'd squeezed through to get into the cave. I pushed myself harder, practically throwing myself toward the light, scrambling up the last few feet of the tunnel. I burst out into the open air, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. Dan was right behind me, collapsing onto the ground beside me, his face pale and slick with sweat. For a long time we just sat there, trying to catch our breath, the reality of what we'd just seen sinking in. "What the hell was that?" Dan finally said, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I whispered, my hands still trembling. "But we're never going back there, ever." Dan didn't argue. He didn't need to. We both knew we were lucky to have made it out alive. As we packed up our gear and left the area, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever was in that cave was watching us, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander into its territory. And as we hiked back through the woods, the stench of that cave still clinging to my clothes, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had gone into that place and never come out. Story 16. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote, wasn't any animal I could name, and in my 15 years as a forest ranger, I thought I'd heard them all. I jolted awake in my small cabin, my heart racing. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:17 a.m. For a moment, I hoped it had been a dream. But then I heard it again, a long, haunting cry that seemed to echo through the trees and right into my bones. Throwing off my blankets, I fumbled for my flashlight and radio. "This is Ranger Mike Hawkins at Outpost 7, I said into the receiver, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anyone copy? I've got some strange activity out here." Static crackled back at me. Of course. I was the only ranger for miles in this section of the Cascade Mountains. Help, if I needed it, was a long way off. I pulled on my boots and jacket, clipped my bear spray to my belt, and grabbed my rifle. Whatever was out there, I needed to investigate. It was my job to keep an eye on the wildlife in this area, and this definitely qualified as unusual activity. The night air was crisp and cold as I stepped outside. My breath fogged in front of me as I swept my flashlight across the small clearing where my cabin stood. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I took a few cautious steps forward, my boots crunching on the pine needles that carpeted the ground. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing. My blood ran cold as I crouched down to examine them. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and they weren't bear tracks. These were clearly bipedal, 2 legs, not 4. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. A bear walking on its hind legs. Some kind of hoax. I followed the tracks with my flashlight. They led into the dense forest that surrounded my cabin. Every instinct told me to go back inside, to wait until daylight, but I couldn't. Whatever had made those prints might still be out there, and I needed to know what it was. Taking a deep breath, I plunged into the trees, following the trail of massive footprints. The forest was different at night, darker, more alive. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to control my breathing, to listen for any sign of the creature that had made those tracks. I'd gone about a quarter mile when I heard it again, that bone-chilling howl, closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from just ahead of me. I froze, my finger tightening on the trigger of my rifle. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. If this was a person playing some kind of sick joke, I wanted them to know I was armed. But if it wasn't, silence fell over the forest. Even the usual nighttime sounds, the hooting of owls, the chirping of crickets, had gone quiet. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight beam danced wildly as my hand shook. I spun in a circle, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to be all around me. Suddenly, a branch snapped loudly to my left. I whirled toward the noise, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. For a split second, my light illuminated something that made my blood turn to ice. Two eyes, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, stared back at me from the darkness. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any normal animal. And they were intelligent eyes, not the blank stare of a deer or the predatory gaze of a mountain lion. These eyes held awareness, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard on my back. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning through the air before going out as it hit the ground. I was plunged into darkness. Panic seized me. I scrambled to my feet, no longer caring about stealth or investigation. All I wanted was to get back to my cabin, to safety. I ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear something moving through the forest. It wasn't running, it was keeping pace with me effortlessly, like a cat toying with a mouse. Whatever it was big and it was fast. I burst out of the tree line into the clearing around my cabin, gasping for breath. Without looking back, I sprinted for the door, fumbling with the keys with shaking hands. Just as I got the door open, I heard a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was a voice, or something like a voice, deep, guttural, almost a growl, but with distinct syllables. It was saying something, but in no language I'd ever heard before. Slowly, I turned around. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 8 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that hung below its knees. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, but not quite. The brow was heavy, the nose flat and wide. But the eyes, those eyes I'd seen in the forest, were unmistakably intelligent. They regarded me with an expression that seemed almost curious. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I knew I should run, should slam the door and call for help. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to even breathe. The creature took a step forward, and that broke the spell. I dove into my cabin, slamming the door behind me and throwing the bolt. I grabbed my radio, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. "This is Ranger Hawkins," I shouted into the receiver. "I need immediate assistance at Outpost 7. There's something out here, something big. Please, if anyone can hear me, I need help." But only static answered me. I was alone. Outside, I could hear heavy footsteps circling my cabin. That strange, guttural voice called out again, sounding almost frustrated. I cowered in the corner, my rifle clutched to my chest as the night wore on. When dawn finally broke, the forest was silent. I waited another hour before finally working up the courage to peer out the window. The clearing was empty, peaceful in the early morning light. Cautiously, I stepped outside, my rifle at the ready. There, in the soft earth, were more of those massive footprints. They circled my cabin several times before heading back into the forest. I followed them to the tree line, but no further. Whatever I had encountered last night, I had no desire to meet it again. As I turned back to my cabin, a glint of something caught my eye. There, stuck to the rough bark of a pine tree, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. I stared at it for a long moment before reaching out with trembling fingers to pluck it from the tree. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, too coarse for a bear, too long for a mountain lion. As I held that tuft of hair, I knew my life had changed forever. I had seen something last night that shouldn't exist, something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. But I also knew that I would be back out in these woods again tonight, and every night after, because now I knew the truth. We're not alone out here, and someone has to keep watch. Story 17. The moment I realized we were lost, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The sun was sinking behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. But all I could think about was the encroaching darkness and the growing sense that we were no longer alone in these woods. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for years. This weekend was supposed to be a simple overnight trip with my best friend, Jake. We'd chosen a trail in the Adirondacks that we'd hiked before, a moderately challenging route that led to a beautiful vista overlooking a pristine mountain lake. But somewhere along the way, we'd taken a wrong turn. "Jake," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice, "I think we should stop and set up camp. It's getting dark fast." Jake, always the optimist, flashed me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, you're probably right. We can figure out where we are in the morning." We found a small clearing just off the overgrown path we'd been following. As Jake started to set up our tent, I gathered wood for a fire. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The trees around our campsite were wrong. Deep gashes marred their trunks, too high up to have been made by a bear. Some of the branches were snapped and hanging at odd angles, as if something large had pushed its way through. "Hey, Jake!" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Come look at this!" Jake jogged over, his brow furrowing as he examined the damaged trees. "Weird," he muttered. "Maybe a storm came through recently." I shook my head. "These marks are fresh. See, the sap is still oozing." A twig snapped in the forest behind us, and we both whirled around. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, to move in ways that shadows shouldn't. "Let's get that fire going," Jake said, his voice tight. We worked quickly, gathering more wood and getting a small blaze started. The warmth and light were comforting, but they also cast long, dancing shadows that made every tree seem alive and menacing. As we sat huddled by the fire, picking at our trail-mix dinner, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting, even the wind seemed to have died down. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "I don't hear anything. That's what's weird." Then we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else. We both scrambled to our feet, Jake grabbing a burning branch from the fire as a makeshift torch. We stood back to back, scanning the darkness beyond our small circle of light. "Hello!" Jake called out, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The only response was another growl, closer this time. I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the firelight. Something big. "We need to get out of here," I hissed. "And go where?" Jake shot back. "We don't know where we are, and it's pitch black out there." He was right, of course. We were trapped. The night wore on, each minute feeling like an hour. We took turns keeping watch, though neither of us could sleep. The sounds continued, growls, heavy footsteps, the cracking of branches. Whatever was out there, it was circling our camp, always just out of sight. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I allowed myself to hope that we'd made it through the worst. That's when Jake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Sarah," he whispered, pointing with a shaking hand. "Look." There, at the edge of our campsite, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. And the shape, it was almost human-like, but distorted, with long, claw-like toes. My breath caught in my throat. "We need to leave. Now." We packed up camp in record time, not bothering to properly extinguish the fire or clean up our site. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made us jump. As we shouldered our packs, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. It started almost human, but rose in pitch until it was something utterly alien. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the underbrush, no longer caring about finding the trail. All that mattered was putting distance between us and whatever had made that sound. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Suddenly, Jake skidded to a halt in front of me. I nearly crashed into him. "Why are we stopping?" I gasped. Jake didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his face pale. I followed his gaze and felt my heart stop. There, not 20 feet in front of us, stood something. It was tall, at least 8 feet, covered in shaggy, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging below its knees, but it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, but twisted, feral. The eyes were intelligent, curious. They regarded us with an awareness that was far too human. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, us, paralyzed with fear, the creature seemingly unsure what to make of us. Then it took a step forward, and the spell was broken. We turned and ran again, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Behind us, we could hear it pursuing, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I could see a road, civilization, safety. We burst out of the tree line onto the asphalt, gasping and stumbling. A car was approaching, and we waved our arms frantically. The driver, an older man in a pickup truck, slowed to a stop beside us. "You folks all right?" he asked, concern etched on his weathered face. "Please," I gasped, "we need help." "There's something—" I turned to point back at the forest, but the words died in my throat. The tree line was empty. Whatever had been chasing us was gone. The man helped us into his truck, eyeing our scratched and bruised bodies with worry. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "What happened to you two?" the man asked, as we sped down the mountain road. Jake and I exchanged a look. How could we possibly explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? "We got lost," Jake said finally. "Spent the night in the woods." The man nodded sympathetically. "These mountains can be tricky. You're not the first hikers to lose their way up here." As we drove, he regaled us with local legends, stories of hikers gone missing, of strange sounds in the night, of giant footprints found in remote areas. With each tale, Jake and I grew more uneasy. When we finally reached the ranger station, we gave a vague report about getting lost. We didn't mention the footprints, the sounds, or the creature we'd seen. Who would believe us? But as we prepared to leave, the ranger pulled us aside. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "I don't know what you saw up there, but I can tell it was something that scared you bad. All I can say is, be careful who you talk to about it. Some things are better left in the woods." We nodded, understanding all too well. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew that what we'd experienced would haunt us for years to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, curious eyes staring back at me from an inhuman face. I also knew that we'd be back. Not right away, but someday. Because now we knew the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness, and a part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, needed to understand. As we pulled into my driveway, Jake turned to me. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what do we do now?" I looked out at the familiar streets of our town, so normal, so safe. Then I thought of those deep woods, of the mysteries they held. "We prepare," I said finally, "and then we go back, because now we know we're not alone out there, and someone has to find the truth." Jake nodded, a mix of fear and determination in his eyes. We both knew that our lives had changed forever. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. But we also knew that we couldn't simply go back to our normal lives, pretending we hadn't seen what we'd seen. The creature in the woods, whatever it was real. And someday, somehow, we would find answers. As I watched Jake drive away, I made a silent vow. We would return to those mountains. We would be better prepared, more cautious. And next time, we would uncover the truth behind the creature that lurked in the shadows of the Adirondacks. The adventure, I realized, was only just beginning. Story 18, the moment I saw it in the photograph, my world shifted. What should have been an empty forest background suddenly held a secret that would consume my every waking moment. I'm a wildlife photographer, used to capturing the beauty and brutality of nature. But nothing in my 15 years of experience could have prepared me for what I was about to uncover in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Alex Reeves, and this is the story of how a routine assignment turned into the most terrifying and exhilarating experience of my life. It all started on a crisp autumn morning. I'd been commissioned by a nature magazine to document the changing colors of the old-growth forests in a particularly isolated region of Washington state. The area was known for its pristine beauty and lack of human interference, perfect for capturing nature in its purest form. I'd set up my gear in a small clearing, surrounded by towering cedars and Douglas firs. The morning mist was just beginning to lift, creating an ethereal atmosphere that any photographer would kill to capture. I spent hours taking shots, moving through the forest, and setting up motion-activated cameras to catch any wildlife that might wander by. It wasn't until I returned to my small cabin that evening and began reviewing the day's work that I saw it. In the background of one of my landscape shots, partially obscured by the misty atmosphere, was a figure. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. The figure was unmistakably humanoid, but far too tall and bulky to be human. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung below its knees. The image was blurry, but I could make out what looked like thick matted fur covering its body. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. Could this be the legendary Sasquatch? The thought both thrilled and terrified me. As a man of science, I'd always scoffed at such legends, but the evidence was right there on my screen, challenging everything I thought I knew. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I had to go back. I had to find out what was really out there. The next morning, I packed my gear with trembling hands. I included extra batteries, more memory cards, and, against my better judgment, a small handgun. I'd never fired it outside of a range, but its weight on my hip provided a small measure of comfort as I ventured back into the forest. I retraced my steps from the previous day, my senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I set up my camera in the same spot where I'd taken the fateful photo, hoping lightning might strike twice. Hours passed, with no sign of anything unusual. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds calling, small animals scurrying through the underbrush. But as the day wore on, an unnatural silence began to fall. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, camera at the ready, but whatever it was had vanished into the dense foliage. My hands shook as I reviewed the shots I'd just taken, but there was nothing there. Frustrated and more than a little unnerved, I decided to push deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer as I moved away from the familiar territory. That's when I found the cave. It was well hidden, its entrance almost completely obscured by thick vegetation. If I hadn't been looking so intently at my surroundings, I might have missed it entirely. A chill ran down my spine as I approached. Something about the cave felt wrong. The air around it was unnaturally still, and I could detect a faint, musky odor that I couldn't quite place. Common sense told me to turn back, to call it a day and return to the safety of my cabin. But the photographer in me, the part that lived for capturing the unknown, urged me forward. With shaking hands, I turned on my headlamp and stepped into the darkness. The cave was larger than I'd expected, stretching back into the mountain. My light barely penetrated the gloom, creating shifting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The musky smell grew stronger as I ventured deeper, mixed with something metallic that made my stomach turn. I'd gone about 50 yards into the cave when my light fell upon something that made me freeze in my tracks. There, on the cave floor, was a massive footprint. It was easily twice the size of my own boot, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The print was fresh, the mud still damp. My heart hammered in my chest as I knelt to examine it more closely. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave. I whirled around, my light dancing wildly across the rocky surfaces. For a split second, my beam illuminated 2 reflective eyes, set high off the ground. They blinked once, and then were gone. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, my gear bouncing painfully against my back as I sprinted out of the cave and through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Those eyes. They hadn't been animal eyes. There had been an intelligence there, a curiosity that was disturbingly human. Whatever was in that cave, it wasn't just some undiscovered species of bear or ape. It was something more. I spent a restless night in the cabin, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. By morning, I'd convinced myself that I needed to go back one last time. I had to get proof, something more substantial than a blurry photo or my own terrified recollections. This time, I approached the cave with more caution. I set up motion-activated cameras at the entrance and at various points leading up to it. Then, steeling my nerves, I ventured inside once more. The cave seemed different in the harsh light of day. Less menacing, but no less mysterious. I photographed the footprint I'd seen the day before, placing a ruler next to it for scale. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I was so focused on documenting the print that I almost missed it. A tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a jagged piece of rock. With trembling fingers, I carefully removed it and placed it in a small evidence bag. This, I thought, could be the proof I needed. As I turned to leave the cave, a sound stopped me in my tracks. It was that same low growl I'd heard the day before, but this time it was behind me, blocking my exit. Slowly, I turned around. There, silhouetted against the light from the cave entrance, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with opposable thumbs. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, with a heavy brow and a flattened nose. But the eyes were unmistakably intelligent. They regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, as if it was just as unsure about me as I was about it. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I knew I should run, should be terrified, but something held me in place. There was a sadness in those eyes, a loneliness that spoke of years of solitude. Slowly, carefully, I raised my camera. The creature tensed, but didn't move as I snapped a single photo. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and disappeared into the depths of the cave. I stumbled out into the sunlight, my mind reeling. I'd done it. I'd seen it, photographed it. I had proof of something that would change the world's understanding of evolution, of history itself. But as I collected my gear and prepared to leave the forest, a nagging doubt began to grow in my mind. What would happen if I revealed this discovery to the world? This creature, this being, had managed to remain hidden for so long. What right did I have to expose its existence? As I drove back to civilization, the weight of my discovery pressed down on me. I had the power to reveal a truth that would shock the world, but I also had the power to protect a creature that clearly wanted to remain hidden. In the end, I made my choice. The photos remain locked away, the hair sample untested. Sometimes I think about going back, about trying to understand more about the incredible being I encountered. But for now, I'm content knowing that there are still mysteries in this world, still wonders waiting to be discovered. and somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, a creature that shouldn't exist continues to roam, safe in its solitude, at least for now. Story 19. The first howl cut through the night like a knife, silencing the usual chorus of crickets and leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. I sat bolt upright in my tent, heart pounding, straining my ears in the darkness. It came again, closer this time, a sound that was neither wolf nor coyote, but something altogether different. My name is Emily Chen, and I've been an avid camper for most of my life. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I thought I'd heard every sound the wilderness could throw at me. But nothing had prepared me for what I was about to experience on this ill-fated camping trip. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with my best friends, Mark and Jess. We'd chosen a remote spot in the Cascades, far from the usual tourist trails, the kind of place where you could truly lose yourself in nature. Little did we know how prophetic that thought would turn out to be. The day had started normally enough. We'd hiked in, set up camp near a picturesque stream, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and swapping stories around the campfire. It wasn't until we'd retired to our tents that things took a turn for the bizarre. After the second howl, I heard Mark's voice from the tent next to mine. "Em, you hearing this?" "Yeah," I whispered back, my mouth dry. "What is that?" Before he could answer, Jess's frightened voice joined in. "Guys, I'm scared. That doesn't sound like any animal I know." I unzipped my tent, peering out into the moonlit clearing. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow over our campsite. The trees surrounding us seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Let's build the fire back up," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, whatever it is, it probably won't come near if we have a good blaze going," Mark and Jess agreed, and we cautiously emerged from our tents. As we gathered wood and stoked the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. With the fire blazing once more, we huddled close, scanning the darkness beyond our little circle of light. For a while, all was quiet except for the crackling of the flames. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was followed by the sound of heavy footsteps circling our campsite just beyond the reach of the firelight. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay calm," I said, even as my own heart raced. "It's probably just curious. If we don't provoke it, it'll probably leave us alone." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Whatever was out there, it didn't move like any animal I'd encountered before. The footsteps were too deliberate, too human. As the night wore on, the unseen creature continued to circle our camp. Occasionally, we'd hear that strange howl again, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, as if it were calling to others of its kind. None of us slept. We sat rigid around the fire, jumping at every sound. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I allowed myself to hope that we'd made it through the worst. That's when Jess screamed. I whirled around to see her pointing at something just beyond our camp. There, half hidden behind a massive pine tree, was a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 7 feet, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging below its knees, but it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. For a long moment, we all froze, staring at the creature as it stared back at us. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it turned and vanished into the forest. "What? What was that?" Mark stammered, his face pale in the early morning light. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with what I knew to be possible. "We need to get out of here," Jess said, her voice shaking. Now, we didn't bother to pack up properly. We stuffed our sleeping bags into our packs, grabbed what food we could, and started down the trail at a near run. The forest that had seemed so welcoming just yesterday now felt oppressive, every shadow potentially hiding another of those creatures. As we hurried along the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle in a way that didn't match our own movements. We'd been walking for about an hour when we came to a clearing, and there, in the soft earth, was a set of footprints that made us all stop dead in our tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boots, 5 toes, unmistakably bipedal, but not human, not even close. "Oh God," Jess whimpered. "It's real. It's all real." As we stood there, staring at the impossible prints, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the forest. It was close, too close. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off down the trail. We ran like we'd never run before, our packs bouncing painfully against our backs. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't slow down. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind us. Heavy footfalls, the cracking of branches, that terrifying howl. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. We burst out of the tree line onto a road, gasping and stumbling. A car was approaching, and we waved our arms frantically. The driver, an older man in a pickup truck, slowed to a stop beside us. "You folks all right?" he asked, concern etched on his weathered face. "Please," I gasped. "We need help. There's something—" I turned to point back at the forest, but the words died in my throat. The tree line was empty. Whatever had been chasing us was gone. The man helped us into his truck, eyeing our scratched and bruised bodies with worry. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "What happened to you three?" the man asked as we sped down the mountain road. We exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. How could we possibly explain what we'd seen? Who would believe us? "We got lost," Mark said finally. "I'd spent a rough night in the woods." The man nodded sympathetically. "These mountains can be tricky. You're not the first campers to run into trouble up here." As we drove, he shared local legends, stories of hikers gone missing, of strange sounds in the night, of giant footprints found in remote areas. With each tale, my unease grew. We weren't the first to encounter whatever was up there, and I doubted we'd be the last. When we finally reached the ranger station, we gave a vague report about getting spooked by animal noises and losing our way. We didn't mention the footprints, the howls, or the creature we'd seen. Who would believe us? But as we prepared to leave, the ranger pulled us aside. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "I don't know what you saw up there, but I can tell it was something that scared you bad. All I can say is, be careful who you talk to about it. Some things are better left in the woods." We nodded, understanding all too well. The drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew that what we'd experienced would haunt us for years to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent, curious eyes staring back at me from an inhuman face. As we pulled into my driveway, Mark turned to me and Jess. "What do we do now?" he asked quietly. I looked out at the familiar streets of our town, so normal, so safe. Then I thought of those deep woods, of the mysteries they held. "We keep it to ourselves," I said finally, "but we also prepare because now we know we're not alone out there. And someday we might need to go back to find answers." Jess and Mark nodded, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. We all knew that our lives had changed forever. The world was bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. As I watched them drive away, I made a silent vow. We would return to those mountains someday. We would be better prepared, more cautious. And next time, we would uncover the truth behind the creatures that lurked in the shadows of the Cascades. The adventure, I realized, was only just beginning, and the wilderness, with all its beauty and terror, would be calling us back sooner than we knew. Story 20. The moment I saw the mutilated deer carcass, I knew this was no ordinary predator. As a seasoned hunter with over 2 decades of experience in these woods, I'd seen my fair share of animal kills, but this was something else entirely. The way the body was torn apart, the strange bite marks that didn't match any known predator. It sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. My name is Jack Thompson, and I've been hunting in the forests of northern Michigan since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but on that fateful day in October, I discovered just how wrong I was. It started as a typical hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work to enjoy the start of deer season, setting up my usual camp deep in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. The first few days were uneventful, peaceful, even. I tracked a few promising bucks but hadn't taken a shot yet. I was in no hurry. Half the joy of hunting for me was simply being out in nature, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. On the fourth morning, I woke before dawn and set out to check my trail cameras. The air was crisp and cool, my breath forming small clouds as I made my way through the underbrush. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of small animals and the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I was about a mile from camp when I first smelled it, the unmistakable odor of death and decay. Following my nose, I pushed through a dense thicket and stumbled upon a scene that stopped me in my tracks. The deer lay in a small clearing, or what was left of it. Its body had been ripped apart with savage force, organs and entrails strewn across the forest floor. But it wasn't just the brutality of the kill that unnerved me. It was the precision. Certain parts had been removed with almost surgical accuracy, while others were torn and shredded. I knelt down to examine the carcass more closely, my hunting instincts kicking in despite the growing sense of unease in my gut. The bite marks were unlike anything I'd ever seen, too large for a wolf or coyote, too precise for a bear. And there was something else, a scent that overpowered even the stench of the dead deer. It was musky, almost human-like, but with an underlying wildness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I stood to survey the area, movement caught my eye. About 20 yards away, half hidden behind a massive oak, something shifted in the shadows. For a split second, I saw a flash of dark fur and what looked like the glint of eyes reflecting the early morning light. Then it was gone, moving with a speed and silence that defied its apparent size. My heart raced as I raised my rifle, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness of a forest holding its breath. I should have left right then, should have packed up camp and headed back to civilization, but curiosity and a lifetime of hunting instincts got the better of me. Whatever had made that kill was still out there, and part of me needed to know what it was. I spent the rest of the day tracking, following a trail that seemed to appear and disappear at random. Broken branches too high up to be made by any normal animal. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on thorny bushes, and always that strange, musky scent lingering in the air. As the sun began to set, I reluctantly headed back to camp. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Could it be some kind of undiscovered species? A bear with a genetic mutation? Or was I letting my imagination run wild, seeing patterns where there were none? I ate a quick dinner of canned stew, my ears straining for any unusual sounds in the gathering darkness. The normal nighttime noises of the forest seemed muted, as if the wildlife was as on edge as I was. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me sitting up in my tent, rifle at the ready. It was near midnight when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a wolf. It was something other. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. And there, just at the edge of the light's reach, I saw them, two eyes reflecting back at me. They were set high off the ground, far higher than any known predator in these woods, and they were intelligent eyes, filled with a curiosity and awareness that was disturbingly human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, watching the darkness for any sign of the creature's return. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I made a decision. I had to know what was out there. I packed a day bag with water, some energy bars, and extra ammo. Then, steeling my nerves, I set out in the direction I'd seen the creature disappear. The forest felt different that morning. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. I moved slowly, cautiously, every sense on high alert. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a set of tracks that made my blood run cold. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. 5 toes, clearly defined but distorted in a way that was neither fully human nor animal, and they were fresh. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give away my position. They led me deeper into the forest, to areas I'd never explored in all my years of hunting these woods. That's when I saw it, a cave entrance, half hidden by dense vegetation. If I hadn't been looking so intently at my surroundings, I might have missed it entirely. The musky scent I'd detected earlier was stronger here, emanating from the dark opening like a physical presence. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get out of these woods and never return, but I'd come too far to give up now. With shaking hands, I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam of light barely penetrated the gloom, creating shifting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The cave was larger than I'd expected, stretching back into the hillside, and everywhere there were signs of habitation, bones piled in corners, some human, some animal. Strips of fur and hide hung from the walls, and the smell, that musky, almost human scent, was overwhelming. I'd gone about 50 feet into the cave when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. I whirled around, my light dancing wildly across the rocky surfaces, and there it was. Standing between me and the cave entrance, blocking my escape, was a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with opposable thumbs and wicked-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes. But there was something feral, something ancient in its gaze. It regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and hunger that made my blood run cold. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. I knew I should raise my rifle, should defend myself, but I was frozen, transfixed by the impossible creature before me. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the cave walls, it charged. I don't remember firing, don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was bursting out of the cave into the sunlight, gasping for breath. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, parked miles away at the forest entrance. As I sped down the mountain road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. But how do you rationalize something that shouldn't exist? I never reported what I saw that day. Who would believe me? But I know what's out there, lurking in the depths of the forest. And I know that the next time I go hunting, it won't be deer I'm looking for. Because now I know the truth. We're not alone in these woods, and the hunter can very easily become the hunted. Story 21. The first splash in the distance could have been anything. A fish jumping, a beaver slapping its tail. But when I saw the massive, dark shape rise from the water at the far end of the lake, I knew this fishing trip was about to become something far more extraordinary and terrifying. My name's Mike Callahan, and I've been fishing these remote lakes in northern Minnesota for over 30 years. I thought I'd seen everything these waters had to offer. Monster pike, record-breaking walleye, even the occasional moose taking a swim. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that day on Lake Nameless. It was a crisp September morning when my buddy Tom and I set out in my old aluminum boat. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to try our luck in one of the most isolated lakes in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. It took us a full day of portaging and paddling to reach Lake Nameless, so named because it was so remote it had never been officially christened. The lake was everything we'd hoped for. Crystal clear water surrounded by dense pine forest, with no sign of human habitation as far as the eye could see. We set up camp on a small, rocky island near the center of the lake, feeling like the only people in the world. That first day of fishing was incredible. We caught more northern pike than we could count, including a few real monsters that gave us the fight of our lives. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, we headed back to our island, already planning the next day's adventure. We were up before dawn the next morning, eager to get back on the water. The lake was shrouded in mist, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. We decided to try our luck at the far end of the lake, where the water was deeper and we hoped the really big fish might be lurking. We'd been fishing for about an hour when we heard the first splash. It was loud enough to make us both look up from our lines, scanning the misty surface of the lake. "Probably just a big pike," Tom said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I nodded, trying to shake off the sudden feeling of unease that had settled over me. We went back to fishing, but I couldn't help noticing how quiet it had become. No birds calling, no insects buzzing. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when we saw it. About 100 yards away, something broke the surface of the lake. At first, I thought it was a log, or maybe even a small island I hadn't noticed before. But then it moved. It was huge, easily 15 feet long, with dark, mottled skin that looked almost furry. For a split second, I saw what looked like a head rise out of the water, a head that was far too large and oddly shaped to be any fish or known aquatic mammal. Tom and I stared at each other, wide-eyed and speechless. Before either of us could say anything, the thing submerged, leaving barely a ripple on the lake's surface. What was that?" Tom finally managed to stammer. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. There was no way something that big could live in a lake this size without anyone knowing about it. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes, both of us scanning the water for any sign of the creature's return. Just as I was starting to convince myself that we'd imagined it, we heard another splash, closer this time. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm despite the fear coursing through me. Tom nodded, already reaching for the oars, but as he began to row, something hit the bottom of the boat with enough force to nearly capsize us. We both yelled, grabbing onto the sides of the boat to steady ourselves. The water around us churned, and I caught a glimpse of something massive moving just beneath the surface. "Row! Tom, row!" I shouted, grabbing the other set of oars to help. We rowed like our lives depended on it, which, for all I knew, they did. The boat seemed to crawl across the water, every second feeling like an eternity. I could hear something moving in the water behind us, keeping pace easily despite our frantic efforts. We were about halfway back to our island when the creature surfaced again, this time barely 20 yards from our boat. In the clear morning light, I got my first good look at it, and my blood ran cold. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in what looked like dark fur rather than scales, but it was the head that truly terrified me. It was almost bear-like, with a broad, flat nose and small, dark eyes that seemed to shine with an unsettling intelligence. As it opened its mouth, I saw rows of sharp, yellow teeth. For a long moment, it regarded us, its gaze unnervingly focused. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it dove beneath the surface again, "It's coming!" Tom yelled, his voice cracking with fear. I felt something brush against the bottom of the boat, and then we were airborne. The creature had rammed us from below with enough force to send our small craft flying. We hit the water hard, the cold shocking the breath from my lungs. As I surfaced, gasping for air, I saw our boat floating upside down about 10 yards away. Tom was nowhere to be seen. "Tom!" I shouted, spinning in the water, searching desperately for any sign of my friend. That's when I felt something brush against my leg, something big. I've never swum so fast in my life. I made it to the overturned boat in what felt like seconds, scrambling to pull myself out of the water. As I clung to the aluminum hull, I saw Tom surface a few yards away. "Swim!" I yelled. "It's coming!" Tom's eyes widened in terror as he saw something move in the water behind him. He swam towards me with powerful strokes, his face a mask of panic. Just as he reached the boat, something large broke the surface behind him. I caught a glimpse of fur, teeth, and those terrifyingly intelligent eyes before it submerged again. We clung to the overturned boat, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature circled us, sometimes coming close enough that we could see its dark shape just beneath the surface, other times disappearing into the depths of the lake. "What do we do?" Tom whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, trying to think through the panic. Our island was still a good quarter-mile away. There was no way we could swim that far with that thing in the water. As if reading my thoughts, the creature surfaced again, closer this time. It let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the water. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite animal, not quite human. That's when I noticed the paddles floating nearby, knocked loose when our boat capsized. If we could reach them, maybe we could use the overturned boat as a makeshift raft. "Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "when I say go, we're going to push off towards those paddles. Ready?" He nodded, his knuckles white where he gripped the boat. "Go!" We kicked off hard, pushing the boat towards the floating paddles. The creature let out another growl, and I heard the splash as it began to move towards us. My hand closed around one of the paddles just as I felt something brush against my leg. Without thinking, I swung the paddle hard, feeling it connect with something solid. The creature let out a roar of pain or anger, I couldn't tell which, and retreated. Taking advantage of its momentary distraction, we managed to grab the other paddle and start propelling our makeshift raft towards the island. It was slow going, the overturned boat was unwieldy, and we were both exhausted and terrified. But the alternative was unthinkable, so we pushed on. The creature continued to circle us, sometimes coming close enough that we could smell its musky animal odor. But it didn't attack again. It was almost as if it was curious. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, we finally reached the rocky shore of our island. We scrambled onto land, collapsing on the pebble beach, gasping and shaking. From the safety of the shore, we watched as the creature surfaced one last time. It regarded us with those unnervingly intelligent eyes for a long moment. Then, with a flick of its massive body, it dove beneath the surface and disappeared into the depths of Lake Nameless. We didn't stay to see if it would return. We packed up our remaining gear and started the long journey back to civilization, our minds reeling from what we'd encountered. I've never told this story publicly before. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw that day on Lake Nameless. And I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the remote wilderness, just waiting to be discovered. I haven't been fishing since that day, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself looking out at the dark water of the lakes near my home, wondering what might be hiding beneath the surface, waiting for unwary anglers to venture too far from shore. Story 22. The first cow disappeared on a moonless night in October. By the time I found the second one, torn to shreds in the north pasture, I knew we were dealing with something far more dangerous than any normal predator. Something that left tracks I'd never seen before and made sounds that chilled me to my very core. My name's Robert Hawkins, and I've been running my family's cattle ranch in eastern Oregon for nigh on 30 years. We've had our share of troubles with coyotes and the occasional mountain lion, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that descended on our land that autumn. It started innocently enough. I noticed one of our heifers was missing during the morning head count. Not too unusual. Sometimes they wander off, get stuck in a gully, or find a weak spot in the fence. I spent the day searching, but as night fell, there was still no sign of her. The next morning, I saddled up my horse, blew, and rode out to the far reaches of the property. That's when I found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The fence along the north pasture was damaged, but not in any way I'd seen before. The steel wire was twisted and bent, not cut or broken. It looked like something massive had simply pushed its way through. I dismounted to examine the damage more closely. That's when I saw the tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print. 5 toes, clearly defined, but distorted in a way that was neither fully human nor animal. And there was something else. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught in the barbed wire. A chill ran down my spine as I remounted Blue. Whatever had done this was still out there, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't finished. Over the next week, 3 more cows vanished without a trace. The ranch hands were getting nervous, muttering about wolves or maybe a grizzly that had wandered down from the mountains. But I knew better. No wolf pack could take down a full-grown cow without leaving evidence, and there hadn't been confirmed grizzly sightings in this part of Oregon for decades. It was on a crisp Saturday morning that I found the second cow, or what was left of it. The carcass was in the north pasture, torn apart with savage force. But it wasn't just the brutality of the kill that unnerved me, it was the precision. Certain parts had been removed with almost surgical accuracy, while others were shredded beyond recognition. As I knelt to examine the remains, my nostrils filled with a scent that overpowered even the stench of the dead cow. It was musky, almost human-like, but with an underlying wildness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That night, I sat on the porch with my rifle across my lap, watching the darkness, the usual sounds of the night. Crickets chirping, the distant howl of coyotes seemed muted, as if the wildlife was as on edge as I was. It was near midnight when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion. It was something other. I stood, raising my rifle, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness, and there, at the edge of the light cast by the porch lamp, I saw them. 2 eyes reflecting back at me. They were set high off the ground, far higher than any known predator in these parts, and they were intelligent eyes, filled with a curiosity and awareness that was disturbingly human. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and vanished into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the porch, rifle at the ready, watching the darkness for any sign of the creature's return. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I made a decision. I had to know what was out there. I saddled up Blue at first light and rode out to the north pasture. The morning mist hung low over the fields, giving everything an otherworldly appearance. I followed the fence line, looking for any sign of the creature's return. That's when I saw it, a cave entrance, half hidden by dense brush. If I hadn't been looking so intently, I might have missed it entirely. The musky scent I'd detected earlier was stronger here, emanating from the dark opening like a physical presence. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to ride home and call in help. But I'd come too far to give up now. I dismounted, tied Blue to a nearby tree, and drew my rifle. With shaking hands, I clicked on my flashlight and stepped into the cave. The beam of light barely penetrated the gloom, creating shifting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The cave was larger than I'd expected, stretching back into the hillside, and everywhere there were signs of habitation. Bones piled in corners, some clearly from cattle, others I couldn't identify. Strips of hide hung from the walls, and the smell, that musky, almost human scent, was overwhelming. I'd gone about 50 feet into the cave when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. I whirled around, my light dancing wildly across the rocky surfaces, and there it was. Standing between me and the cave entrance, blocking my escape, was a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with opposable thumbs and wicked-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes. But there was something feral, something ancient in its gaze. It regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and hunger that made my blood run cold. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. I knew I should raise my rifle, should defend myself, but I was frozen, transfixed by the impossible creature before me. Then, with a roar that shook dust from the cave walls, it charged. I don't remember firing, don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was on Blue's back, the horse galloping at full speed across the pasture. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, its roars echoing across the land. We made it back to the ranch house, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to simply disappear. It had claimed this territory as its hunting ground, and it wasn't going to give it up without a fight. Over the next few weeks, I fortified the ranch as best I could. I brought in extra hands, set up floodlights around the perimeter, and kept the cattle close to the barn at night. But still, the attacks continued. We'd hear that bone-chilling roar in the night, and come morning, another cow would be gone. It all came to a head on a moonlit night in November. I was doing a final check of the perimeter when I heard the unmistakable sound of the barn door being wrenched open. I raced towards the sound, my heart in my throat. As I rounded the corner of the barn, I came face to face with the creature. It stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight, a struggling calf held in its massive arms. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw something I never expected. Intelligence, and something that looked almost like regret. Without thinking, I raised my rifle. The creature's eyes widened, and it let out a sound that was part roar, part mournful cry. It dropped the calf and turned to flee, moving with that impossible speed. I had a clear shot. I could have ended it right there, but something stayed my hand. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was a recognition of something in those two human eyes. Whatever the reason, I lowered my rifle and watched as the creature disappeared into the night. That was the last we saw of it. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear a distant roar echoing from the mountains. And every now and then, I'll find a strange track or a tuft of coarse hair caught on the fence. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me? But I know what's out there, lurking in the wilderness beyond my ranch. And I know that the line between man and beast, between the known and the unknown, is far blurrier than most people realize. I still run my ranch, still tend to my cattle. But now, when I ride out to the north pasture, I always keep one eye on the tree line, because I know that somewhere out there, something extraordinary is watching and waiting, and part of me wonders if, someday, it might return. Story 23. The first scream pierced the night like a knife, jolting me awake in my tent. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, a sound of pure terror that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was something else. My name is Alex Chen, and I'm an experienced mountaineer. I've climbed peaks all over the world, from the Rockies to the Himalayas. But nothing in my years of alpine adventure could have prepared me for what I encountered on that ill-fated expedition to Mount Isolation in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Our team consisted of 4 climbers, myself, my longtime climbing partner Mike, and 2 newcomers, Sarah and Tom. We'd chosen Mount Isolation for its remoteness and challenging terrain. The peak itself isn't particularly high, but its isolation and the rugged approach make it a test for even seasoned climbers. The first 2 days of our ascent were uneventful. We made good progress, setting up camp each night in small clearings among the dense pine forests that blanketed the lower slopes. It wasn't until the third night, when we'd set up our high camp just below the tree line, that things took a turn for the bizarre. The scream that woke me was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It started low, almost like a growl, then rose to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, fumbling for my headlamp. "Did you guys hear that?" Mike's voice came from the tent next to mine, tense with alarm. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. The sound echoed off the mountain slopes, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. We all emerged from our tents, huddling together in the small clearing. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the black sky. But the usual night sounds, the rustle of small animals, the hoot of owls, were eerily absent. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, at a loss for words. In all my years of mountaineering, I'd never encountered anything like this. We decided to build up our fire, hoping the light and heat would keep away whatever had made that ungodly sound. As the flames grew, casting flickering shadows across our faces, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard. "Maybe it's some kind of bird we're not familiar with," Tom suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We sat in tense silence, straining our ears for any further sounds. For a while, all was quiet except for the crackling of our fire. I was just starting to think that maybe, just maybe, we'd imagined the whole thing when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving through the forest just beyond the light of our fire. We all froze, eyes locked on the tree line. The footsteps circled our camp, sometimes drawing nearer, sometimes fading into the distance. Whatever it was big, much bigger than a person. Then, at the edge of our firelight, I saw them. 2 eyes, reflecting the flames, set high off the ground. They blinked once, slowly, then vanished back into the darkness. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. The others nodded, their faces pale in the firelight. None of us slept that night. We kept the fire burning high, talking in low voices, trying to convince ourselves that there was a logical explanation for what we'd seen and heard. As dawn broke, painting the sky in brilliant pinks and oranges, we began to relax. Whatever had been out there in the night seemed to have retreated with the coming of day. That's when Sarah screamed. We all turned to see her pointing at something just beyond our campsite. There, pressed into the soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any footprint I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot. 5 toes, clearly defined, but distorted in a way that was neither fully human nor animal. The imprint was deep, suggesting whatever had made it was incredibly heavy. As we examined the print, I noticed something else. A tuft of coarse, dark hair caught on a nearby bush. I reached out to touch it, and a shiver ran down my spine. It was like no animal fur I'd ever felt before. We debated what to do next. The sensible thing would have been to pack up and head back down the mountain. But we'd come so far. We're so close to the summit. In the light of day, it was easy to dismiss our night terrors as imagination run wild. We decided to continue our ascent, but agreed to stick close together and remain vigilant. The day's climb was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made us jump. We saw no further signs of our nighttime visitor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we neared the summit, the terrain became more challenging. The trees thinned out, replaced by bare rock and patches of stubborn alpine vegetation. We picked our way carefully across a particularly tricky section of loose scree when we heard it again. That same unearthly scream, echoing across the mountainside. We all stopped in our tracks, instinctively huddling closer together. The sound seemed to be coming from just ahead of us, near the summit. We should go back, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Part of me agreed with her, but we were so close to the top, and some reckless part of me needed to know what was up there. We've come this far, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Let's at least make the summit. The others reluctantly agreed, and we pressed on. The last 100 yards to the summit were the longest of my life. Every step felt like we were walking into the lair of some unknown predator. Finally, we crested the peak. The view was breathtaking. Miles of wilderness stretching out in every direction, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. But we barely had time to appreciate it. There, on the far side of the small summit plateau, was a cave, and emerging from that cave was a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms hung long at its sides, ending in hands with opposable thumbs and wicked-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was almost human, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes. But there was something feral, something ancient in its gaze. It regarded us with a mixture of curiosity and hostility that made my blood run cold. For a long moment, we all stood frozen, staring at each other across the summit plateau. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature charged. We turned and ran, all thoughts of climbing safety forgotten in our panic. We scrambled down the scree slope we'd so carefully ascended, rocks sliding and tumbling beneath our feet. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking loose more rocks. A boulder the size of a car tire whizzed past my head, missing me by inches. We reached the tree line, plunging back into the forest. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran, but we didn't slow down. The creature's roars echoed through the trees, sometimes sounding closer, sometimes farther away. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. We burst out of the forest onto the trail we'd ascended days earlier. Without discussion, we turned downhill, desperate to put as much distance between us and the creature as possible. As we ran, the roars behind us grew fainter. Either the creature had given up the chase, or we'd managed to outpace it, but we didn't slow down until we reached the trailhead, collapsing next to our parked car, gasping for breath. We never reported what we saw that day on Mount Isolation. Who would believe us? But I know what I encountered up there, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the remote wilderness, just waiting to be discovered. I still climb. The mountains still call to me, but now, when I'm setting up camp in some remote alpine meadow, I always keep one eye on the tree line. Because I know that somewhere out there, something extraordinary is watching and waiting, and part of me wonders if, someday, I might encounter it again. The mystery of what we saw on Mount Isolation haunts me to this day. Was it some undiscovered species, a relic from a bygone age, or something else entirely? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but I do know that my experience on that mountain changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the possibility that there's more to this world than we can explain, more wonders and terrors lurking in the wild places than we can imagine. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that unearthly scream echoing from the distant mountains, calling me back to uncover its secrets. Story 24. The day I set foot in the Alaskan wilderness to study an unknown species was the day my understanding of the natural world changed forever. As a wildlife biologist, I've encountered my fair share of unusual phenomena, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in those remote forests. What began as a scientific expedition quickly descended into a nightmare that continues to haunt me to this day. My name is Dr. Sarah Collins, and I've spent the last 15 years studying elusive and rare species across North America. When reports of strange sightings and unexplained animal behavior started flooding in from a remote area of Alaska, I knew I had to investigate. The local Inuit people had stories of a creature they called a mawak, a being that walked like a man but moved with the stealth of a predator. Most of my colleagues dismissed it as folklore, but I sensed there was something more to these tales. I arrived in Alaska in early June, when the days were long and the forest was alive with the sounds of wildlife. My base camp was a small cabin on the edge of a vast wilderness, miles from the nearest town. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I was used to solitude in my work. The first few days were uneventful. I set up trail cameras, collected samples, and interviewed local hunters about their experiences. Most were reluctant to talk, their eyes darting nervously to the tree line as if afraid of being overheard. One grizzled old trapper, his face weathered by years in the wilderness, gripped my arm as I was leaving. "Be careful out there," he warned, his voice low. "There's something in those woods that ain't natural, something that hunts the hunters." I brushed off his warning as superstition, but his words would come back to haunt me in the days that followed. It was on the 5th day that I found the first real evidence. I was checking my trail cameras when I came across a set of tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger, with distinct claw marks at the tips of what should have been toes. I made a plaster cast of the print, my heart racing with excitement. This could be the discovery of a lifetime. That night, as I was reviewing the footage from my trail cameras, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Most of the videos showed nothing unusual. Deer, the occasional bear, small mammals going about their business. But one video, taken in the dead of night, showed a large, shadowy figure moving through the forest. It was bipedal, but moved with an unnatural fluidity, its long arms almost touching the ground. The infrared camera caught the gleam of its eyes, too high off the ground for any known predator in the area. I must have watched that clip 100 times, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a bear, I told myself. A large black bear walking on its hind legs. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was something else entirely. The next day, I ventured deeper into the forest than I had before, determined to find more evidence. The woods seemed different somehow, quieter, as if the usual chorus of birds and small animals had been silenced. I found more tracks, and tufts of coarse, dark hair snagged on tree bark. As I collected samples, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was late afternoon when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. I caught glimpses of dark fur, heard the snap of branches under heavy feet. Fear gripped me, and I ran. I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me. I could hear it behind me, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line and into the clearing where my cabin stood. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath. As my panic subsided, I realized how foolish I'd been. I was a scientist, for God's sake. I should be observing, documenting, not running away in terror. But as night fell and strange noises echoed from the forest, I was glad for the solid walls of the cabin between me and whatever was out there. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle from outside had me sitting bolt upright, straining my ears. Just before dawn, I heard heavy footsteps on the cabin's porch. Something large moved past the window, momentarily blocking out the pale pre-dawn light. Then, silence. When morning came, I found enormous footprints in the soft earth around the cabin. On the porch railing was a tuft of hair, the same coarse, dark hair I'd found in the forest. With shaking hands, I collected it for analysis. Over the next few days, the encounters escalated. My trail cameras captured more glimpses of the creature, always at night, always just out of clear view, but they were enough to confirm that this was no known species. Its size, its way of moving, its apparent intelligence in avoiding clear shots, all pointed to something beyond current scientific understanding. One night, About a week into my stay, I woke to the sound of my sample cooler being opened. I'd left it outside, secured with a heavy-duty lock. Heart-pounding, I peered out the window. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was the creature. It stood well over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws, but it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a disturbing blend of ape and man, with a sloping forehead, a broad nose, and eyes that gleamed with unmistakable intelligence. The creature was examining the samples I'd collected, turning them over in its massive hands with an almost human-like curiosity. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it turned and looked directly at me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer the observer. I was the observed. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, showing a mouthful of sharp teeth. Then, with shocking speed, it vanished into the forest, taking my samples with it. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my cabin, my mind reeling. What I'd seen defied everything I thought I knew about wildlife in North America. This was no undiscovered ape or some lost human ancestor. This was something else entirely. The next morning, I made the difficult decision to end my expedition early. As much as the scientist in me wanted to stay and study this incredible creature, the human in me recognized the danger. This was not an animal to be observed and documented. It was intelligent, curious, and potentially dangerous. As I packed up my equipment, I grappled with what to do with my findings. I had video evidence, hair samples, plaster casts of footprints. It was the discovery of a lifetime, the kind of thing that could make a career, but I also knew how it would be received by the scientific community. I'd be labeled a crackpot, my reputation ruined. In the end, I decided to keep my discoveries to myself, at least for now. I needed time to analyze my findings, to make sense of what I'd seen. And part of me feared what might happen if the existence of these creatures became public knowledge. How long before their habitat was overrun by curiosity seekers and would-be monster hunters? As I drove away from that remote cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror made me step on the gas, not slowing until I reached the main road. It's been 2 years since my encounter in the Alaskan wilderness. I've analyzed the samples I managed to keep, reviewed my footage countless times. What I found both excites and terrifies me. There is a species out there, unknown to science, that possesses a level of intelligence that rivals our own. They've managed to stay hidden, to become the stuff of legend rather than scientific fact. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out into the darkness, remembering those intelligent eyes looking back at me, and I wonder who really was the subject of study during those weeks in Alaska. Was I the observer or the observed? And what else is out there, lurking in the wild places of the world, watching and waiting? One thing I know for certain, the line between legend and reality is far blurrier than I ever imagined, and sometimes the monsters from our stories are all too real.